My wife of 40 years asked for a divorce on my 70th birthday. She stood up at the head of the table, smiled at our guests, and slid a thick manila envelope right across the icing of my birthday cake. She looked me in the eye and said she wanted the estate, the luxury cars, and the entire logistics company I built from nothing. She wanted everything except our son. My lawyer later begged me to fight her in court. I refused. I looked at her and said she could have it all. Everyone sitting at that table thought I had lost my mind. They watched me sign away my life's work without shedding a single tear. But what my greedy wife and her arrogant lawyer did not know was that I had already won. She smiled in triumph right until the moment her lawyer whispered 5 devastating words. I am Cornell, 70 years old, and this is the story of my ultimate revenge. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always comes with a heavy price. The crystal chandelier above the long mahogany dining table cast a warm and inviting glow, completely contrasting the freezing, bitter temperature that had just taken over the room. It was supposed to be a milestone celebration of my life. Instead, it felt like a public execution. I stared down at the thick manila envelope resting aggressively against the ruined vanilla frosting of my cake. Valerie stood at the opposite end of the table wearing a custom silk dress that cost more than my very first car. She did not even have the basic decency to wait until the caterers and our dinner guests had left the house. She wanted an audience for my humiliation. She crossed her arms and delivered her demands with a chilling, calculated lack of emotion. She told me she was entirely tired of pretending to be the dutiful, supportive wife of an aging man. She declared that she wanted the 10,000-square-foot mansion we currently lived in. She demanded the entire fleet of luxury vehicles sitting in the climate-controlled garage. But most importantly, she firmly stated that she wanted sole ownership of the supply and logistics company that bore my last name. She laid out her extortion like she was casually ordering a meal at a high-end restaurant. Then she turned her cruel, dismissive gaze toward the other end of the table. Tariq, our 38-year-old son, was sitting quietly, his hands folded nervously in his lap. Tariq was a dedicated social worker spending his life helping at-risk youth in the toughest neighborhoods. He never cared for the luxury lifestyle, and Valerie absolutely despised him for it. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at him and laughed a cold, hollow laugh. She told me that I could keep the charity case failure. She stated she had absolutely no use for a son who threw away a prestigious education just to work in the slums for pennies. She actually spoke those horrific words out loud in front of our family and the people we called friends. She told me to pack my bags, take my deeply disappointing son, and vacate the estate premises by the end of the week. She claimed she needed a fresh start, untethered from the dead weight of a husband who was past his prime and a son who actively embarrassed her social circle. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. Our daughter Monique sat next to Valerie, sipping her expensive champagne, not saying a single word to defend her own flesh and blood brother. Next to Monique sat her husband Bradley. Bradley was a fast-talking, incredibly arrogant opportunist who married into my family strictly for the access to my bank accounts. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his amber drink, watching the brutal destruction of my marriage, like it was an entertaining television show. Neither of them showed a single ounce of shock or pity. I realized right then, looking at their smug faces, that they had orchestrated this entire ambush together. I slowly shifted my gaze back to Tariq. I looked down and noticed his worn-out dress shoes. They were polished carefully, but they were clearly nearing the end of their life. He wore them with pride because he bought them with his own hard-earned money. Looking at those scuffed shoes, a massive flood of memories hit me hard. I remembered 40 years ago, long before the mansion, the sports cars, and the endless private bank accounts. I remembered working grueling 16-hour shifts in the freezing rain at the local lumber yards just to keep the heat on in our tiny, drafty apartment. I remembered the bleeding blisters on my hands and the racist corporate bankers who literally laughed in my face when I asked for a small business loan. I built a massive empire with blood, sweat, and absolute sheer will. And while I broke my back laying the foundation of our generational wealth, Valerie was busy shopping, attending charity galas, and completely forgetting where she came from. She had grown so incredibly accustomed to the heavy gold crown I placed on her head that she completely forgot who built the castle. Any other man in my position would have flipped the dining table in a blind rage. Any other man would have screamed, cursed, or immediately demanded half of everything in a bitter legal war. But I did not raise my voice. I did not show them a single fraction of the intense rage boiling inside my chest. I slowly stood up from my chair, taking my time to adjust the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. The entire room held its collective breath. Bradley leaned forward with a sickening grin, clearly hoping I would make a complete fool of myself. Valerie lifted her chin defiantly, bracing for a massive shouting match she had undoubtedly rehearsed with her expensive lawyers for months. Instead, I looked at her with a terrifying calmness that seemed to deeply unsettle her. I silenced the quiet whispers spreading around the room by simply raising one hand. I looked deeply into the eyes of the woman I had spent 4 decades providing for, protecting and loving. I saw absolutely no love looking back at me, only a bottomless dark pit of pure entitlement. I nodded slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I told her in a steady, even tone that we did not need to fight. I told her that she did not need to hire legal sharks to bleed me dry in family court. I looked directly at her and simply said, "Agreed, you get it all." Valerie blinked rapidly, completely, taken aback by my total surrender. Monique nearly dropped her champagne glass onto the expensive rug. Bradley let out a low, arrogant chuckle, his face breaking into a wide, victorious smirk. They thought I was just a tired, broken old man who simply lacked the energy to defend his own legacy. They truly believed I was handing over the keys to the kingdom out of pure exhaustion. Bradley could not contain his toxic greed for even a single minute. He stood up abruptly, walked right over to my side of the table, and rudely held out his empty hand. He told me that since I was giving everything up anyway, he might as well take the keys to my vintage Porsche right now. He practically spat in my face, saying a guy taking the public bus would not need a classic sports car. I reached deep into my pocket, pulled out the heavy silver keys, and dropped them directly into his open palm. I gave him a dead, chilling smile and told him to enjoy the ride. He snatched the keys and walked away laughing. Bradley had absolutely no idea that he had just gladly accepted a financial death sentence. At exactly 6 in the morning the very next day, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand. I answered it immediately, to hear Tariq breathing heavily on the other end of the line. He was not a man who panicked easily, but the raw anxiety radiating from his voice was unmistakable. He told me that Monique and Bradley were currently standing on the front porch of the estate guest house. They had not even waited 24 hours after the birthday dinner. They had brought a professional locksmith with them to drill out the heavy deadbolts. I told my son to stay completely calm and instructed him not to engage with them under any circumstances. I threw on a thick wool coat over my flannel shirt and drove straight over to the property. The cold morning mist was still clinging to the manicured lawns when I pulled my vehicle up to the driveway. I stepped out to see my daughter and her husband standing there like conquering royalty, surveying their newly stolen kingdom. The locksmith was already packing up his heavy industrial drill, having successfully breached the solid oak door of the guest house where Tariq had lived peacefully for the past 3 years. Monique stood on the pristine stone walkway, clutching a steaming cup of expensive artisan coffee. She was wearing a designer velvet tracksuit that probably cost more than a month of rent for a normal working family. She did not even have the basic decency to look me in the eye when I walked heavily up the path. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the distant tree line, pretending I did not exist. Bradley, however, was practically vibrating with toxic, unearned excitement. He stepped right into my path, aggressively blocking the doorway. He puffed out his chest, wearing a sickeningly smug expression that made my blood run absolutely cold. He loudly declared that the guest house was being repurposed as a private yoga studio for Monique starting today. He ordered Tariq to get his worthless trash off the property immediately, or he would call the police to report a trespasser. Tariq walked out carrying 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. He looked completely exhausted and deeply defeated. He dropped the heavy bags onto the gravel driveway and turned to face his sister. He asked Monique how she could possibly do this to her own flesh and blood. Monique finally looked at him, her eyes completely devoid of any familial warmth or compassion. She coldly stated that this was strictly a business decision and that he had severely overstayed his welcome. She told him that their mother owned the entire estate now, and their mother wanted him gone before noon. I stepped directly between my son and his abusers. Bradley immediately tensed up, balling his hands into tight fists, clearly hoping I would lose my temper and take a swing at him. He wanted me to strike him so he could play the victim, call the local authorities, and press felony assault charges against an old man. I flatly refused to give him that pathetic satisfaction. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not hurl any bitter insults. I simply turned my back to him, looked directly at Tariq, and told him to load his bags into the back of my rusty 1998 Ford pickup truck. It was the exact same battered truck I used when I first started my logistics company decades ago, a vehicle Valerie had relentlessly begged me to scrap because it embarrassed her in front of her wealthy friends. Tariq hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding silently. We quietly carried his remaining belongings across the wet morning grass, completely ignoring the venomous taunts coming from the porch. Bradley leaned against the newly replaced doorframe, crossing his arms in a disgusting display of false dominance. As I tossed the last heavy duffel bag into the rusted truck bed, Bradley shouted across the open yard. He told us to enjoy the homeless shelter. He called me a washed-up old man and laughed loudly, a grating sound that echoed across the massive stone estate I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. I closed the heavy steel tailgate with a loud metallic slam, looked at Bradley one last piercing time, and got into the driver's seat without uttering a single syllable in response. The heater in the old Ford roared to life as we pulled out of the grand iron gates of the estate for the last time. Tariq stared blankly out the passenger window, watching the massive mansion slowly disappear in the rearview mirror. He turned to me, his voice cracking slightly, and apologized profusely. He said he felt like a massive burden and that he was the sole reason I lost everything in the brutal divorce. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the road ahead and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. I told my son to never apologize for who he is or the noble work he does. I explained that the millions of dollars sitting in those offshore corporate accounts never truly mattered to my soul. I grew up with absolutely nothing, wearing hand-me-down clothes, and I knew exactly how to survive on nothing. My entire goal in building that massive logistics empire was to create a lasting legacy of helping our community. I wanted to build modern schools, fund youth community centers, and lift our people out of generational poverty. Valerie took that righteous dream and twisted it into a nightmare of endless consumption and hollow high society gala events. She completely destroyed the soul of our family just to acquire more useless luxury objects to fill her massive empty rooms. I looked over at Tariq and assured him that losing the stone mansion was not a defeat at all. It was simply a highly necessary sacrifice to fully expose the deep rot that had infected our family tree. The heavy silence between us was comforting, a stark contrast to the shouting and cruelty we had just escaped. I knew that Tariq was the only real wealth I had left, and protecting his future was my ultimate priority. Once we reached the main interstate highway, I pulled the heavy truck over onto the gravel shoulder. I reached deep into my heavy coat pocket and pulled out my secure cell phone. I dialed a private unlisted number that I had memorized years ago. The encrypted line rang exactly twice before my attorney Jonathan answered. Jonathan was not just a standard family divorce lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate strategist who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of international business for over 20 years. He was the only person on earth who knew the absolute terrifying truth about my complex corporate finances. I stared at the morning commuter traffic rushing past our parked truck. I spoke clearly and firmly into the receiver. I told Jonathan that the bait was officially taken. I confirmed that Valerie had taken full physical possession of the estate and that Monique and Bradley were aggressively moving their belongings into the main house as we spoke. I told him they had forcibly evicted Tariq this morning, exactly as we had predicted they would during our strategy meetings. They were acting entirely on their own blind greed, rushing to claim their stolen prizes without conducting a single shred of financial due diligence. They were so incredibly desperate to sit on the fake throne that they never bothered to check if the majestic castle was built on a foundation of quicksand. Jonathan let out a low, deeply satisfied chuckle on the other end of the line. The sound was sharp and full of calculated predatory anticipation. He told me that everything was proceeding perfectly according to our strict master timeline. He officially verified that the judge had signed the final divorce decree, making it fully binding and completely irreversible. Valerie had legally claimed absolute ownership of the corporate holding company and all the associated estate properties. Jonathan paused for a brief moment, letting the massive gravity of the situation settle in. Then his voice dropped an octave, turning ice cold and razor sharp. He said that this was very good news, because the $15 million balloon payment on that exact estate triggers in exactly 72 hours. The atmosphere inside the sleek, glass-walled mediation room on the 45th floor of the downtown high-rise was freezing, both physically and emotionally. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside a soundproof chamber designed for tearing lives apart. Valerie sat directly across from me, flanked by her notoriously aggressive divorce attorney, a ruthless woman named Fiona. Fiona was widely known in the city as a corporate legal shark who specialized in utterly destroying wealthy men and leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. She did not waste a single second on basic human pleasantries. The very moment I sat down next to my own lawyer, Jonathan, Fiona slid a massive, heavily tabbed stack of legal documents aggressively across the polished table. She tapped her sharply manicured nail against the thickest pile of papers, her eyes locked onto mine with predatory, unwavering confidence. Fiona cleared her throat and began listing Valerie's absolute demands in a sharp, uncompromising tone that left zero room for negotiation. She stated clearly that my wife was not just taking the physical properties, the luxury vehicles, and the liquid cash accounts. Fiona demanded that I immediately surrender 100% of my voting rights, my board seat, and my executive control over the logistics holding company I had founded decades ago. She insisted that my continued presence in the company would be an unacceptable conflict of interest and a source of deep emotional distress for Valerie. She wanted me completely erased from the corporate registry. Jonathan immediately sprang into action, playing his designated role in our plan with absolute perfection. He slammed both of his fists hard onto the heavy wooden table, rattling the expensive crystal water glasses. He raised his voice to a booming shout, declaring that this demand was completely outrageous, predatory, and entirely unprecedented in family court. He argued fiercely that forcing the removal of a founding chief executive officer without a massive transitional financial buyout was literal highway robbery. He stood up from his leather chair, threatening to walk out of the mediation entirely and drag Valerie through a brutal, deeply public and humiliating trial that would expose her to the tabloids. Valerie simply rolled her eyes, looking completely bored and mildly annoyed by Jonathan's highly theatrical display of anger. She leaned back in her plush chair, slowly sipping sparkling water as if we were casually haggling over the price of a used television, not the complete dismantling of my entire life's legacy. I let Jonathan rant and rave for another full minute to truly sell the grand illusion that we were fighting a desperate losing battle against a superior force. Then I slowly raised my right hand. Jonathan stopped speaking instantly. He sat back down, breathing heavily and aggressively, adjusting his tie in perfectly feigned frustration. I looked at Fiona, and then I looked deeply at Valerie. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit, pulled out my heavy gold fountain pen, and uncapped it with a sharp click. I told Fiona that there was absolutely no need for a messy trial. Without a single moment of hesitation, I pulled the massive stack of executive transfer documents toward me and began signing my name on every single dotted line. As the dark black ink flowed onto the crisp white paper, legally signing away the very name of the company I had bled for, a vivid rush of powerful memories flooded my mind. I remembered the suffocating heat of the 1980s, driving a rusted delivery van with a broken radiator for 20 hours a day just to fulfill my first major freight contract. I remembered standing exhausted in the sterile lobbies of massive corporate banks, being looked down upon by wealthy white loan officers who smiled to my face and then threw my business proposals straight into the trash because of the color of my skin. I had to fight twice as hard, work 10 times as long, and endure constant daily humiliation just to get a single foot in the door of the industry. I built a massive logistical empire out of pure grit, late nights, and relentless, agonizing determination. And now, I was smoothly handing the keys to that massive empire over to a deeply greedy woman whose biggest daily struggle was deciding which designer handbag matched her expensive shoes. I finished signing the final page of the executive transfer and slid the thick stack back across the wide table. Valerie let out a highly satisfied sigh and smugly adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was a necklace I had purchased for our 25th anniversary back when I still foolishly believed she loved me for who I was as a man, not simply for what my bank account could provide. She looked at me with a sickening expression of total victory, her eyes shining with utter contempt. She then reached into her designer leather briefcase and pulled out one final solitary legal document. She pushed it toward me with a triumphant, wicked smirk. Fiona proudly announced that this paper was a comprehensive cross-liability waiver. She explained in a highly condescending tone that Valerie wanted a completely clean break from my existence. According to Fiona, this document ensured that I could never return in the future to claim any shared financial responsibilities, demand spousal support, or ask for a single dime of the company profits. Valerie wanted absolute, legally binding certainty that she owed me absolutely nothing now and until the end of time. I looked down at the document, keeping my facial muscles perfectly relaxed and completely blank. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, giving me a perfectly timed look of fake, wide-eyed panic, silently begging me not to agree to this final demand. Valerie was so incredibly blinded by her own ravenous greed and so eager to completely erase me from her wealthy new life that she acted with profound recklessness. She saw Jonathan's fake panic and assumed she had cornered me entirely. Wanting to lock in her total victory before I could change my mind, she snatched the document back across the table and boldly signed her own name at the very bottom before I even had a chance to pick up my pen. She completely failed to read the highly specific legal fine print hidden on the second page of that waiver. By legally demanding a clean break and signing that specific liability document, Valerie did not just cut financial ties with me. She officially and legally assumed 100% of the holding company's massive hidden corporate debt. As she handed the signed paper to the mediator with a bright, victorious smile, the heavy steel jaws of my financial trap finally snapped completely shut. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed my fate. The honorable judge peered over his reading glasses, officially declaring the dissolution of our 40-year marriage. With that single strike of the gavel, it was legally finalized. Valerie was officially awarded absolute ownership of the massive estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore bank accounts, and complete executive control over the logistics empire I had built from the ground up. She had won it all. The courtroom was stiflingly quiet, filled only with the rustling of court documents being officially stamped and filed into the public record. Jonathan sat quietly beside me, carefully packing his leather briefcase. On the opposite side of the aisle, the atmosphere was a sickening celebration of unearned victory. Valerie immediately stood up from her heavy oak table, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her tailored designer suit. She looked like a conqueror surveying a burning city. She deliberately walked around her table, ignoring the standard courtroom decorum, and stopped just a few feet away from where I was sitting. She looked down at me, her eyes completely devoid of any human empathy, shining with a toxic mixture of absolute triumph and deep-seated malice. She leaned in slightly, ensuring her voice carried across the silent room. She told me to pack whatever cheap clothes I had left and to enjoy rotting away in a state-funded retirement home. She openly laughed, a cold, grating sound, loudly wondering if Tariq would be able to afford a decent nursing facility on his pathetic social worker salary. She bragged that she was going to completely gut the executive board of my company by Friday morning and replace every single loyal employee with her own hand-picked sycophants. She wanted to erase my legacy so thoroughly that no one in the corporate world would even remember my name. Bradley and Monique sat in the gallery right behind her, openly snickering and high-fiving each other like teenagers who had just pulled off a cruel prank. I did not flinch. I did not rise to her bait. I remained perfectly still in my chair, staring straight ahead at the judge's empty bench. I slowly and deliberately adjusted the gold cufflinks on my sleeves, moving with a calm, calculated precision that seemed to completely baffle her. She wanted me to cry, to beg, or to explode in a fit of helpless rage. My absolute silence was the one thing she could not comprehend. I simply nodded at her, acknowledging her cruel words without giving her a single ounce of the emotional satisfaction she was so desperately craving. I knew that true power did not need to shout. As I watched her flaunt her stolen wealth, my mind briefly flashed back to the woman she used to be before the millions completely rotted her soul. I remembered the young, humble girl who used to pack my meager lunches in brown paper bags when I was driving trucks. Back then, she would smile brightly over a cheap cup of diner coffee, happy just to have a roof over our heads. But the moment the company took off and the massive checks started rolling in, that sweet woman completely vanished. The money acted like a toxic fertilizer, growing her deepest insecurities into massive, uncontrollable arrogance. It corrupted her entirely, and worse, it bled directly into our daughter. Valerie had meticulously molded Monique into a spoiled, heartless clone of herself, a woman who valued designer labels far more than basic human decency. They both worshipped at the altar of extreme wealth, completely forgetting the brutal sacrifices it took to build their temple. Valerie was still basking in the glow of her perceived victory, preparing to walk out of the courtroom to face the local business reporters she had prematurely called. She turned back to her shark attorney, Fiona, extending her hand for a celebratory handshake. But the handshake never happened. The heavy courtroom doors suddenly burst open, breaking the sterile silence. A young legal assistant from Fiona's corporate firm rushed down the center aisle, her high heels clicking frantically against the polished hardwood floor. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed with absolute panic. She completely ignored court etiquette, sprinting directly up to Fiona and aggressively shoving a freshly printed live bank statement directly into the lawyer's hands. Fiona looked deeply annoyed by the interruption, scolding the assistant for bursting into the courtroom. But the assistant did not back down. She pointed a trembling finger at the highlighted bottom line of the financial document, urging Fiona to read it immediately. Fiona let out an irritated sigh and lowered her eyes to the paper. I watched intently as the arrogant smirk completely melted off Fiona's face in a matter of seconds. The color violently drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking as pale as a ghost. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, causing the crisp paper to rattle loudly in the quiet room. She read the highlighted section a second time, then a third, as if she could not believe her own eyes. The terrifying reality of my financial trap had just physically landed right in her hands. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The heavy, suffocating tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Valerie, noticing her lawyer's sudden physical collapse, frowned deeply and demanded to know what was wrong. She reached out, trying to snatch the document away. Instead of handing it over, Fiona aggressively grabbed Valerie's arm, pulling her client close with a desperate, terrified grip. Fiona's eyes were wide with absolute horror as she looked directly into Valerie's confused face. Her voice was barely a trembling whisper, but in the pin-drop silence of the room, the words echoed with devastating clarity. Fiona leaned in and breathed the 5 words that would completely destroy my ex-wife's life. "You just assumed the debt." Valerie violently snatched the crisp piece of paper right out of her lawyer's trembling hands. Her eyes darted frantically across the bold black text and the heavily stamped bank logos. Right there in the middle of the page, highlighted in a blinding yellow marker, was the indisputable proof of her total destruction. It was a formal notice of a massive $15 million corporate loan secured directly against the logistics company and the entire residential estate. Her breath caught sharply in her throat as she read the final line of the document. The loan was not structured for long-term monthly payments. It was a massive balloon payment, and the entire $15 million principal was due in full by tomorrow morning. The opulent kingdom she had just spent months fighting to steal was suddenly drowning in an ocean of immediate crushing debt. Total panic completely consumed her. The smug, victorious facade she had worn for the past hour shattered into a million jagged pieces. Valerie spun around and lunged violently toward the heavy wooden partition separating the gallery from the judge's bench. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that the honorable judge return to the courtroom immediately. She waved the bank statement frantically in the air, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She yelled that there had been a massive mistake, a horrible fraud orchestrated by a bitter, vindictive old man. She demanded that the court immediately reverse the final divorce decree and tear up the cross-liability waiver she had just signed minutes earlier. The judge, who had just stepped down from the bench and was walking toward his private chambers, stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his face hardening into an expression of absolute disgust. He walked back to the elevated platform and glared down at the screaming woman. The heavy silence of the courtroom magnified the sheer desperation in Valerie's shrill voice. Fiona, her highly paid shark attorney, was desperately tugging at Valerie's designer skirt, begging her client to stop making a scene, but Valerie was completely out of her mind with terror. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard that the sound echoed like a gunshot. He told her in a voice as cold as ice that this was a court of law, not a playground where she could undo her legally binding decisions simply because she suddenly realized the consequences. He reminded her sharply and publicly that she was the one who ruthlessly demanded 100% of the assets. He pointed out that she had employed aggressive legal tactics to completely box her husband out of his own company. He stated for the official record that she had been repeatedly advised to conduct thorough financial due diligence, yet she blindly signed the liability waiver purely out of greed and malice. She had dug her own grave in front of the entire court, and now she was legally forced to lie in it. The judge adjusted his robes, looked Valerie directly in her tear-filled eyes, and delivered the final blow. He firmly stated that the divorce was absolute, the asset transfer was final, and the court was officially adjourned. He turned his back on her and walked through the heavy oak doors of his chambers, leaving her completely trapped in the financial cage she had built for herself. Standing perfectly still in the center of the courtroom, a sickening wave of realization washed over Valerie. She finally understood the terrifying depth of my absolute silence. I had not surrendered out of weakness or exhaustion. I had used her own ravenous blind greed as the ultimate weapon against her. 2 years ago, I had quietly discovered that she was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars from our joint accounts into a secret offshore trust for her personal use. Instead of confronting her in a screaming match that would have resulted in a standard 50-50 divorce settlement, I began meticulously restructuring the entire corporate entity. I legally took out that massive $15 million loan using the company name and the main estate as the primary collateral. I had essentially turned the magnificent logistics holding company into a massive ticking time bomb just waiting for the day she finally demanded the keys. Breathing heavily, Valerie shoved Fiona away and bolted down the center aisle of the courtroom. She pushed past Monique and Bradley, who were now standing up with expressions of complete confusion on their faces. Valerie did not bother to explain anything to them. She burst through the heavy double doors of the courthouse, her expensive high heels clicking frantically against the marble floors of the lobby. She burst out into the cold afternoon air, fumbling with her designer handbag with shaking hands. She pulled out her sleek cell phone and immediately dialed the direct emergency line of my company's chief financial officer. She paced back and forth on the concrete steps of the courthouse, her heart pounding relentlessly against her ribs. The phone rang 3 times before the CFO finally answered. Valerie did not offer a greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive order. She identified herself as the new sole owner of the logistics holding company by strict order of the family court. She commanded the CFO to immediately bypass all standard protocol and completely drain every single dollar from the corporate cash reserves. She ordered him to wire the entire sum directly to the primary banking institution holding the massive mortgage. She firmly believed that the company, which generated tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue, would have more than enough liquid cash to instantly absorb the brutal balloon payment and save her newly stolen estate from complete foreclosure. The CFO remained completely silent for a long, agonizing moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely flat and devoid of any respect for the woman screaming at him on the phone. He told her there was absolutely no cash left to drain. Valerie froze, demanding to know what he meant. The CFO calmly explained that exactly 1 year ago, Cornell legally sold the entire operational branch, the physical truck fleet, and the entire revenue-generating cash flow to a heavily guarded private trust. He bluntly informed her that she did not win a logistics empire today. She only won a massive multi-million-dollar empty box that was currently suffocating under a $15 million debt. The silver vintage Porsche tore down the coastal highway. Bradley had the convertible top down, allowing the crisp afternoon wind to aggressively whip his hair as he blasted heavy bass through the expensive custom sound system. He gripped the worn leather steering wheel tightly, feeling like an absolute king ruling over a newly conquered kingdom. He had waited 3 excruciating years playing the role of the dutiful son-in-law to a man he secretly despised, all for this exact moment of ultimate payoff. He pressed his designer leather shoe harder onto the gas pedal, pushing the classic German engine to its absolute limit. He laughed out loud over the roaring wind, fully believing he had finally secured a lifetime of effortless luxury. He had the keys to the massive mansion, the high society connections, and now the ultimate physical status symbol. He felt entirely invincible. He was completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse that had just struck Valerie at the downtown courthouse. The sudden blinding flash of red and blue police lights in his rearview mirror violently shattered his arrogant daydream. The aggressive wail of a police siren cut sharply through his loud music, demanding his immediate compliance. Bradley let out a highly irritated sigh, rolling his eyes as he aggressively downshifted and pulled the expensive sports car onto the dusty gravel shoulder of the highway. He was not afraid in the slightest. He figured he had simply been caught speeding, a minor inconvenience that he could easily resolve by throwing a wad of cash at the problem or having Valerie's expensive corporate lawyers make the ticket completely disappear. He casually adjusted his designer sunglasses, fully preparing to use his rehearsed wealthy privilege on the approaching highway patrol officer. However, the situation immediately deviated from his arrogant expectations. The police cruiser parked a safe distance behind the Porsche, but a massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck abruptly pulled up directly in front of him, aggressively blocking his path forward. 2 large men wearing heavy work boots and bright yellow visibility vests stepped out of the truck. One of them carried a thick metal clipboard. They did not look like highway patrol. The police officer approached Bradley's window, firmly asking him to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. Bradley scoffed loudly, demanding to know why a simple speeding ticket required a massive tow truck. The officer remained completely stoic, instructing Bradley to hand over the keys immediately. The man with the clipboard stepped forward, loudly identifying himself as a certified bank repossession agent. He looked directly at Bradley and flatly stated that the vintage Porsche was officially registered as a heavily secured corporate asset. He explained that the logistics holding company had completely defaulted on a massive $15 million balloon payment earlier this afternoon. Because the loan was strictly in default, the bank had instantly activated the seizure clause on all physical assets listed in the corporate registry. The car no longer belonged to Cornell, it did not belong to Valerie, and it certainly did not belong to Bradley. It belonged to the bank, and they were taking physical possession of it right now. Bradley's face turned an ugly dark shade of red. He completely lost his temper, launching into a vicious, obscenity-laced tirade against the repo agents and the police officer. He aggressively puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate men who did this highly dangerous job for a living. This explosive, entitled reaction was the ultimate manifestation of his deeply pathetic nature. Bradley was a career grifter, a man who had never worked a legitimate, honest day in his entire adult life. He had spent his 20s bouncing between failed startup ideas and racking up massive credit card debt before he successfully targeted my daughter. He had painstakingly studied Monique's insecurities, played the role of the charming, ambitious entrepreneur, and married her strictly to gain direct access to my massive bank accounts. He viewed our family entirely as his own personal automated teller machine. He had spent years swallowing his own toxic pride just to live rent-free in our guest house and eat the expensive food I paid for. Now the absolute panic of losing his stolen golden ticket completely stripped away his charming disguise, exposing the desperate parasite underneath. He aggressively shoved his finger into the lead repo agent's chest, screaming that there had to be a massive clerical error. He shouted that he was a millionaire and that his mother-in-law owned the largest logistics firm in the entire state. The repo agent simply swatted Bradley's hand away, completely unimpressed by the frantic name-dropping, and signaled his partner to hook the heavy steel chains to the front axle of the vintage Porsche. Seeing the dirty metal chains dragging across the pristine silver paint of his ultimate prize caused something inside Bradley's brain to completely snap. He lunged forward with blind, unearned rage. He grabbed the heavy steel chain, trying to physically rip it out of the second agent's hands. The agent shoved him back firmly, telling him to back off before he got seriously hurt. Bradley swung a wild, clumsy punch, striking the repo agent hard in the jaw. The situation instantly escalated from a standard civil repossession into a violent criminal offense. The police officer who had been standing by to ensure a peaceful transfer of property immediately sprang into action. He shouted a loud, commanding warning, ordering Bradley to get down on the ground with his hands behind his back. Bradley, completely blinded by his own toxic entitlement and pure panic, spun around and shoved the uniformed police officer hard in the chest. That was his ultimate fatal mistake. The officer did not hesitate for a single second. He swiftly drew his taser and fired. The electric prongs struck Bradley squarely in the torso. Bradley let out a high-pitched scream as his muscles violently locked up, sending him crashing face first onto the harsh gravel shoulder of the highway. The officer aggressively pinned him down in the dirt, violently wrenching his arms behind his back and slapping heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The officer hauled a groaning, completely humiliated Bradley up from the dirt and slammed him face down against the sleek, sloping hood of the seized Porsche. The cold metal pressed harshly against his bruised cheek as the officer loudly read him his Miranda rights for assaulting a law enforcement official. Breathing heavily, tasting dirt and his own blood, Bradley desperately twisted his head toward the passenger seat where he had dropped his cell phone. He frantically screamed at the officers to let him call his wife. He yelled for Monique to call her father and fix this massive mistake immediately. But his desperate screaming was completely useless. Even if the police officers graciously allowed him to make his phone call, the line would never connect. Exactly 10 minutes ago, sitting comfortably in my quiet new penthouse office, I had calmly logged into the family cellular account and completely terminated Monique's voice and data plan. Bradley was entirely on his own, locked in handcuffs, watching his stolen kingdom vanish before his very eyes. While Bradley was tasting the bitter gravel on the side of the highway, Valerie was executing her own desperate escape plan. She had hung up on the chief financial officer in a state of absolute paralyzing terror. Her mind violently raced to the millions of dollars in uninsured diamond jewelry, limited edition designer handbags, and untraceable cash hidden securely in the master bedroom wall safe. If the bank was already moving rapidly to seize the corporate assets, she knew it was only a matter of hours before they targeted the primary residential estate. She practically flew across the city in her luxury sedan, running red lights, violently honking her horn, and swerving aggressively through dense afternoon traffic. Her singular, frantic goal was to reach the mansion, pack as many Hermes bags and diamond necklaces into the trunk as physically possible, and flee to an exclusive high-end hotel before the crushing legal reality of her massive debt finally caught up to her. She slammed her expensive leather shoe onto the brakes, screeching to a chaotic smoking halt right in front of the grand entrance of the estate. But she was entirely too late. The towering wrought iron gates, which usually swung open automatically at the respectful signal of her approaching vehicle, were firmly chained shut with heavy-duty industrial padlocks. Valerie stared in absolute disbelief through the cold iron bars. Two marked county sheriff vehicles were parked aggressively in the circular driveway, their red and blue lights silently flashing. A highly coordinated team of men in sharp charcoal suits, clearly high-level bank asset managers, were marching systematically across the pristine, manicured lawns holding thick clipboards. Bright neon orange eviction and foreclosure notices were already plastered mercilessly across the solid mahogany front doors and the tall custom glass windows. Valerie threw her car into park, leaving the engine running and the door wide open as she scrambled out of the driver's seat. She sprinted toward the iron gates, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She grabbed the cold metal bars and began shaking them violently, screaming at the top of her lungs like a madwoman. She demanded that the men inside immediately open the gates for the legal owner of the property. One of the uniformed sheriffs heard the chaotic commotion, turned around, and slowly walked down the long driveway toward her. He did not look intimidated by her expensive designer clothes or her furious, entitled shouting. He carried a highly official stack of laminated court documents. Valerie began aggressively commanding the officer, stating that there had been a monumental clerical mistake at the downtown courthouse. She yelled that she simply needed exactly 10 minutes inside her own bedroom to retrieve her personal medication and a few highly sentimental items. The sheriff simply shook his head, his expression completely devoid of any human sympathy. He flatly informed her that the primary mortgage holder had executed a rapid seizure protocol due to a massive uncured default on a $15 million corporate loan. He stated with absolute legal authority that every single item currently inside the property boundaries, including the antique furniture, the imported artwork, and the highly valuable contents of the personal safes, was now legally classified as collateral belonging strictly to the banking institution. Valerie shrieked that her diamond necklaces and exclusive Hermes bags were her own personal property, entirely separate from her ex-husband's ruined logistics company. The sheriff calmly held up a printed copy of the exact cross-liability waiver she had so proudly signed just a few hours earlier. He pointed out that by assuming the corporate entity unconditionally, she had legally tied all contents of the primary residence to the massive corporate debt. Valerie stepped back from the heavy iron gates, her breathing incredibly shallow and wildly erratic. She stared through the unyielding bars at the magnificent stone facade of the mansion she had so ruthlessly demanded in the bitter divorce. This was the exact house where she used to host incredibly lavish, heavily catered garden parties strictly designed to mock her less wealthy friends. She used to stand gracefully on that grand sweeping balcony holding a crystal glass of imported champagne, looking down her nose at the very people she deemed entirely beneath her elevated social status. She had completely built her entire identity around the fragile illusion of infinite, untouchable wealth. She had openly mocked me for my humble working-class beginnings and viciously belittled our devoted son Tariq for choosing a noble life of service over a shallow life of luxury. Now the cold, brutal reality of her own greedy actions had completely stripped away her shining golden armor. The arrogant woman who once ruthlessly dictated the social hierarchy of the city's wealthy elite was currently standing on a dirty public sidewalk, completely locked out of her own stolen castle, possessing absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on her back. Pure, unadulterated desperation completely overrode whatever tiny shred of logical reasoning Valerie had left in her panicked brain. She could physically see the bank officials walking out of the grand front door carrying a clipboard, actively inventorying the priceless imported artwork hanging in the massive foyer. The agonizing thought of those strange men touching her exclusive designer collections drove her completely insane. She noticed a very small gap between the heavy iron gate and the massive stone pillar, a space just wide enough for a highly desperate person to forcefully squeeze through. Completely ignoring the stern, loud warnings of the law enforcement officer standing right in front of her, Valerie aggressively shoved her body into the narrow gap. The rough stone violently tore the delicate silk of her expensive custom dress, but she did not care. She managed to violently push her way onto the private property, screaming frantically that she was going to get her diamonds and absolutely nobody was going to stop her. The sheriff reacted instantly and decisively. He lunged forward, grabbing her firmly by the arm before she could take more than 3 steps onto the expensive gravel driveway. Valerie fought back like a cornered feral animal. She swung her heavy designer handbag wildly, striking the officer hard in the shoulder. The sheriff immediately twisted her arm sharply behind her back, pinning her aggressively against the cold stone pillar of the front gate. He raised his voice, warning her in a booming, highly authoritative tone that she was actively trespassing on federally seized bank property and directly assaulting an officer of the law. He bluntly stated that if she did not cease her aggressive physical resistance immediately, she would be leaving the beautiful estate in the back of a police cruiser wearing heavy steel handcuffs. The terrifying threat of actual physical jail time finally broke her completely. Valerie stopped struggling, her entire body going completely limp and defeated against the cold stone pillar. The sheriff forcefully escorted her back through the iron gate and shoved her roughly onto the public sidewalk. Completely defeated, utterly humiliated, and physically exhausted, the former untouchable queen of high society slowly sank down and sat right on the dirty concrete curb. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her perfect, expensive makeup completely ruined by hot, bitter tears. Suddenly, the sleek cell phone buried inside her torn handbag buzzed sharply. She pulled it out with shaking fingers, desperately hoping for a miracle call from her expensive lawyers. Instead, it was a direct text message from me. It was a high-resolution photo of Tariq and me standing proudly together, smiling widely as we cut a bright red ribbon on a massive state-of-the-art medical clinic. Miles away from the cold concrete curb where Valerie sat entirely defeated, the atmosphere was electric with hope and celebration. Bright camera flashes illuminated the grand sunlit atrium of the brand-new Community Health Foundation. The massive glass doors were open to the public, welcoming hundreds of local residents, city officials, and eager journalists. Standing confidently behind a sleek wooden podium was Tariq. He was no longer the exhausted, beaten-down outcast carrying heavy duffel bags out of a guest house. He stood tall in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, looking every inch the powerful visionary chief executive officer he had just become. The bold letters behind him spelled out his name and the mission of the massive medical clinic. He smiled warmly as the crowd erupted into applause, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse that had just consumed his toxic mother and his arrogant sister. The press conference began with a flurry of raised hands and shouting voices from prominent local reporters. A senior financial journalist from the City Tribune stood up, pointing a digital recorder toward the podium, and aggressively asked Tariq how a grassroots social worker managed to secure the massive, unprecedented capital required to build such a state-of-the-art medical facility. I stood quietly in the back of the crowded atrium, leaning comfortably against a cold marble pillar, watching my son command the room with absolute grace. I kept my hands tucked deeply in my pockets, a profound, silent pride swelling inside my chest. This was the exact moment the master plan was fully unveiled to the world. Tariq leaned into the microphone, his voice steady, rich, and echoing clearly across the massive room. He explained that the foundation was completely bankrolled by a singular, incredibly generous private trust. He revealed that a massive capital injection of exactly $15 million had been legally secured and meticulously transferred over the past 24 months to ensure the clinic was fully funded, entirely debt-free, and structurally immune to any outside financial interference. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, completely unaware that they were actively documenting the brilliant, flawless laundering of my corporate debt. The $15 million that Valerie currently owed to the ruthless banking institution was not lost, wasted, or hidden in some shady offshore account. It had been carefully washed through a series of completely legal corporate investments and securely locked away within the impenetrable iron vault of Tariq's nonprofit foundation. Because the trust was established long before the brutal divorce proceedings were officially finalized, and because Valerie had eagerly signed away any right to audit my personal philanthropic ventures in her rush to steal my company. The entire $15 million asset pool was legally untouchable by the family court. She had aggressively demanded the hollow shell of a logistics company, and I had quietly handed the actual golden egg directly to the son she had so viciously discarded. Tariq expertly answered every single complex question the press threw at him, detailing the comprehensive healthcare services, the expansive youth outreach programs, and the free psychological counseling centers the clinic would seamlessly provide to the most vulnerable, neglected neighborhoods in the city. He spoke with a fierce, undeniable passion that proved exactly why he was the perfect man to lead this massive organization into the future. He was not corrupted by the blinding allure of extreme wealth. He viewed the millions of dollars simply as a powerful, necessary tool to uplift the people who desperately needed it most, rather than a heavy weapon to crush his enemies. Another reporter asked Tariq who his primary inspiration was for launching such a massive community initiative. Tariq looked up from his prepared notes, his eyes scanning the crowded room until they locked directly onto mine. The room grew quiet as he spoke from the heart. He told the crowd that for his entire adult life, his own mother had openly mocked his career in social work. She had constantly called him a failure and a bitter disappointment simply because he did not chase multi-million-dollar corporate salaries. She valued people only by the brand of their shoes and the size of their bank accounts. But while she was actively trying to crush his spirit, his father was quietly standing right behind him, secretly funding his righteous dream. Tariq publicly acknowledged that I had sacrificed my own peace and voluntarily walked into a brutal financial fire just to ensure his vision could finally become a reality. He declared that this clinic was the true legacy of the family name, built on a solid foundation of hard work and genuine compassion, completely separated from the toxic greed that had destroyed his childhood home. As the press conference officially concluded and the massive crowd began to mingle around the lavish, beautifully arranged catering tables, the heavy glass doors of the atrium swung open violently. The private security guard stepped forward, but the frantic intruder aggressively pushed her way past them before they could react. It was Monique. The stark, horrifying contrast between the glamorous, arrogant woman she had been yesterday morning and the desperate, wild creature she was right now was absolutely jarring. Her expensive designer velvet tracksuit was completely ruined, covered in dark mud, foul-smelling grease stains and harsh highway dirt. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, tangled mess, and her face was heavily streaked with thick, smeared mascara. She frantically scanned the brightly lit room, looking completely out of place and highly erratic among the sharply dressed professionals and respected community leaders. She spotted Tariq stepping down from the wooden podium and immediately sprinted across the polished floor toward him, completely ignoring the shocked gasps and disgusted stares of the wealthy local journalists. She practically collided with her brother, her chest heaving violently as she desperately gasped for air. She loudly blurted out that Bradley had been violently arrested on the side of the highway and was currently sitting in a cold holding cell at the county jail facing serious felony assault charges. The police had physically seized their stolen vintage Porsche, the bank had completely locked them out of the massive estate, and her cell phone had been abruptly shut off without warning. She had walked 3 agonizing miles in the freezing wind just to find this clinic because she had absolutely zero cash to pay for a taxi or a bus. She was completely broken, absolutely terrified, and entirely out of options. Monique desperately grabbed Tariq by the arm, her fingernails digging sharply into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She began to sob uncontrollably, a pathetic high-pitched wail that echoed awkwardly through the sophisticated atrium. She aggressively played the ultimate family card, begging her brother to immediately wire $50,000 to the bail bondsman and demanding a high-paying executive job at his new foundation to keep her off the streets. She cried that blood was thicker than water and that he was legally obligated to save his only sister from homelessness. Tariq did not flinch, he did not pull away, and he did not offer her a single comforting hug. He simply stared down at her frantic, tear-stained face with my signature cold, dead, and utterly merciless eyes. Monique stared up into those icy eyes, fully expecting them to soften and fill with the familiar warmth she had exploited her entire life. For as long as she could remember, Tariq had always been the designated peacemaker of our deeply dysfunctional family. He was the soft-hearted brother who constantly forgave her cruel remarks, the one who always tried to de-escalate the tension during their mother's vicious, screaming tirades. She had deeply relied on his inherent kindness, completely certain that his professional background in social work meant he was fundamentally incapable of turning his back on a family member in need. She squeezed his arm even tighter, putting on her absolute best performance of a terrified, helpless victim. She genuinely believed that if she shed enough tears, wailed loudly enough, and looked pathetic enough in front of his wealthy new colleagues, Tariq would instantly revert to his old submissive self. She expected him to write her a massive check to bail out her violent husband and offer her a high-level executive position without asking a single difficult question. She thought she could manipulate his deep well of compassion exactly like she had done 1,000 times before. Instead of wrapping his arms around her and offering the unconditional blind support she aggressively demanded, Tariq physically recoiled. He deliberately and forcefully peeled her sharply manicured fingers off the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket. He took a deliberate step backward, creating a harsh, undeniable physical boundary between them. His face remained entirely impassive, completely devoid of the brotherly warmth she was so desperately trying to extract. He looked at her not as a sister in distress, but as a highly toxic liability that needed to be swiftly managed. Monique gasped out loud, genuinely shocked by the blatant physical rejection. She opened her mouth to launch into another hysterical, loud plea for cash, but Tariq simply raised a single hand. It was the exact same commanding gesture I had used to silence our mother in the mediation room just a few days prior. The movement instantly silenced her. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that sliced right through the lingering chatter of the massive atrium. He leaned in slightly, ensuring she heard every single word with crystal clarity. He reminded her of the exact sentence she had spoken yesterday morning when she stood on the porch with her arrogant husband and a locksmith. He repeated her cruel statement verbatim, reminding her that she had looked him directly in the eye and declared they were not in the same class. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket, looking down at her ruined velvet clothes, her messy hair, and her tear-streaked face. He nodded slowly, agreeing with her completely. He stated that she was absolutely right, they were not in the same class at all, and they never would be. Then, without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering familial regret, Tariq signaled to the large men standing near the main entrance. He calmly instructed his private security detail to immediately escort the disruptive woman off the Foundation property. Two burly guards in dark suits instantly closed the distance, firmly grabbing Monique by her upper arms. She shrieked in absolute indignation, frantically threatening to sue the medical clinic and screaming that they could not treat their own blood this way. Tariq simply turned his back to her and walked away to rejoin the local journalists, completely unbothered by her chaotic and highly embarrassing exit. As the heavy security guards physically dragged her backward through the grand glass doors and tossed her roughly onto the cold concrete sidewalk, Monique was left entirely stunned. She sat hard on the pavement, staring back at the towering medical facility in total, paralyzing disbelief. The weak brother she had openly mocked her entire life, the man she had violently evicted just 24 hours ago, was completely gone. Sitting there in the dirt, she finally realized the profound transformation that had taken place right under her nose. I had not just secretly funded his community foundation with a massive trust. I had actively forged him into a hardened, highly disciplined leader. I had spent the last year teaching him the brutal realities of corporate survival and the absolute necessity of cutting off toxic parasites, even if they shared your exact bloodline. He was no longer the eternal victim of her relentless bullying. He was an impenetrable fortress, and she was locked permanently on the outside, forced to survive in the harsh reality she had helped create. Sitting alone in the freezing wind, utterly humiliated and completely broke, her initial panic rapidly morphed into a dark, venomous anger. She aggressively wiped the smeared makeup off her cheeks, her mind racing desperately for a viable financial lifeline. Bradley was currently rotting in a county jail cell facing felony charges and was entirely useless to her now. Tariq had successfully shielded himself behind a wall of private security and newfound corporate power. That left only one person responsible for this massive, catastrophic collapse of her luxurious, effortless life. She realized with blinding clarity that her mother Valerie was the sole architect of this total destruction. Valerie was the one who blindly demanded the heavily mortgaged holding company. Valerie was the one who aggressively signed the Fatal Cross liability waiver without bothering to read the fine print. And Valerie was the one who had arrogantly dragged them all into this massive financial grave just to satisfy her own ravenous ego. Monique knew that family loyalty was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she wanted to survive the week, she needed liquid cash immediately, and she needed to completely sever herself from her mother's rapidly sinking ship. She refused to go down with the ruined estate or live in a homeless shelter. She decided right then and there to completely save herself by selling out the very woman who had taught her how to be utterly ruthless in the first place. Monique reached into her stained velvet pocket and pulled out her expensive cell phone. Her primary cellular data plan was completely dead, but she aggressively scanned the area and connected to the free public wireless internet signal radiating from the clinic's main lobby. She frantically scrolled through her extensive digital contacts until she found the direct number of a notoriously sleazy tabloid journalist she had briefly met at a high society charity gala last year. She tapped the screen and initiated an encrypted internet audio call. The journalist answered on the second ring, sounding highly skeptical of the sudden contact. Monique did not waste a single second with polite pleasantries. She spoke in a low, urgent whisper fueled by pure malice and absolute desperation. She told the journalist that she had undeniable hard proof that her mother Valerie had committed massive federal tax fraud during her marriage. She stared intensely at the heavy glass doors of the clinic and delivered her final devastating blow. She asked him exactly how much cash he was willing to wire her right now for the exclusive, highly incriminating documents. The automated voice of the county correctional facility interrupted the quiet hum of my new penthouse office. It announced a collect call from an inmate. I pressed the button to accept the charges, leaning back into my plush leather chair. The chaotic, deafening background noise of the maximum security holding cell immediately flooded the speakerphone. I could hear heavy metal doors slamming, guards barking harsh orders, and desperate men shouting obscenities. Then came Bradley's voice. He was practically hyperventilating. The arrogant, fast-talking grifter who had confidently demanded the keys to my vintage Porsche yesterday afternoon was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, whimpering child. He was shivering, whispering frantically into the grimy jailhouse payphone, begging me not to hang up the line. He said he had used his one legally mandated phone call on me because Monique was sending his calls straight to voicemail. He was completely trapped, deeply terrified of the hardened men surrounding him, and absolutely desperate for a financial lifeline. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my freshly brewed black coffee, enjoying the rich, dark aroma, while Bradley hyperventilated on the other end of the line. The panoramic view of the city skyline from my new office was absolutely breathtaking, a stark contrast to the filthy concrete box Bradley currently occupied. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply asked him why he thought I would ever accept a collect call from the man who had gleefully helped steal my entire estate. Bradley choked back a harsh sob and immediately launched into a frantic, desperate negotiation. He aggressively threw his own wife under the bus before I even finished my sentence. He swore up and down that he never actually wanted to kick Tariq out of the guest house. He claimed that Monique and Valerie had entirely manipulated the situation, aggressively forcing his hand. I listened to his pathetic lies in total silence, letting the heavy, uncomfortable pause stretch out until the crushing weight of his anxiety caused him to crack. He finally got to the real point of his desperate phone call. His bail was set at $50,000, and the local bail bondsman demanded a 10% cash fee up front to secure his release. Bradley begged me to wire $5,000 immediately. In exchange for the money, he offered to become my ultimate star witness. He promised to testify against Valerie and Monique in any future legal proceedings. He claimed he had hard physical proof that Valerie had illegally hidden massive amounts of marital assets long before the divorce papers were ever drafted. He swore he knew exactly where she buried the cash and how Monique helped her wash the money through fake luxury purchases and dummy corporate accounts. He pleaded with me, promising that if I just got him out of this terrifying cell, he would personally hand me the keys to destroy them both permanently. He repeatedly called me sir, a respectful word that had never once crossed his lips during the entire 3 years he lived rent-free on my property. He promised to be my loyal, obedient soldier. He was entirely willing to burn his own marriage to the ground just to save his own skin. I let him ramble on, listening to the sheer panic elevating the pitch of his voice. He described the horrible smell of the holding cell, the terrifying stares of the violent offenders sitting next to him on the steel bench, and his absolute certainty that he would not survive the night if he was transferred to the general population block. He offered to sign any legal document I wanted. He offered to wear a hidden wire. He offered to publicly humiliate himself if it meant he could walk out of those heavy iron doors. The sheer magnitude of his cowardice was truly a spectacle to behold. He had spent his entire life running away from hard work and personal responsibility, relying strictly on his charm and his perceived superiority to glide through life. Now stripped of his expensive clothes and his stolen wealth, he was reduced to a sniveling mess, begging the very man he had tried to completely ruin. Listening to his frantic begging, a deep, highly satisfying sense of vindication washed over my entire being. I vividly remembered the very first time Monique brought this man into my home. He had looked at my massive estate, my expensive art collection, and then looked at me with a thinly veiled expression of sheer disbelief. He was a thoroughly mediocre white man who fundamentally believed that his mere presence instantly elevated our family status. He had spent years making subtle, deeply insulting comments about my race and my age, expertly disguising his toxic prejudice as harmless jokes at the Sunday dinner table. I remembered a specific evening when he loudly joked that I should step down from my own company because the modern corporate world was entirely too complicated for someone of my specific background. He firmly believed he was intellectually superior, completely convinced that he could easily outsmart an old black man who built a business with his bare hands. He had walked through my halls with an unearned swagger, aggressively treating my staff like garbage and treating my wealth as his own personal birthright. Now that same arrogant man was crying into a jailhouse telephone, begging that very same old black man for his physical freedom. The absolute irony was incredibly delicious. I set my coffee mug down on the heavy glass desk and leaned closer to the speakerphone. I kept my voice entirely neutral, expertly hiding the deep amusement swirling inside my chest. I told Bradley that I was willing to seriously consider his proposal. I stated that $5,000 was absolute pocket change to me, and I could easily have the top bail bondsman in the city down at the county jail in less than 20 minutes. Bradley let out a massive, echoing sigh of relief, loudly thanking me and aggressively praising my generosity. But then I stopped him cold. I told him that I did not do business based on blind trust. If he wanted my money to secure his freedom, I needed immediate actionable collateral. I demanded that he confess everything he knew about their illegal activities right now directly on this federally recorded jailhouse line. Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. The basic animal instinct for self-preservation completely overrode any lingering loyalty he ever had to my daughter. He eagerly spilled every single dark secret they had aggressively kept from me. He detailed exactly how Monique maxed out secret high-limit credit cards under my company's name to secretly fund his failed business ventures. He brutally exposed Valerie's long-standing affairs with younger men, explicitly naming the expensive downtown hotels she used to hide her chronic infidelity. He rapidly listed the specific offshore banking accounts and the exact fraudulent methods they used to systematically siphon cash from my personal accounts. He gave me times, dates, and highly specific dollar amounts. He sang like a desperate canary, completely incinerating his wife and his mother-in-law to secure his own immediate escape. When he finally ran out of breath, Bradley desperately asked if I had heard enough information to send the bail money. I calmly tapped a button on my desk console, securely saving the high-definition digital audio file of his entire treacherous confession. I told him his eager cooperation was highly appreciated. Then, without saying another single word, I ended the call, leaving him listening to a dead dial tone in a terrifying maximum security holding cell. I absolutely never intended to pay a single dime of his bail. Instead, I picked up my secure cell phone, attached the highly explosive audio file to a new message, and sent it directly to Monique. I sat back, steepled my fingers, and watched the illuminated screen until the small delivery icon officially changed to read. Monique sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a dingy motel room she had rented with the very last $100 bill hidden in her designer purse. Her hands shook violently as she tapped the play button on the audio file I had just sent her. The high-definition recording filled the cramped, foul-smelling room with crystal clarity. She listened in absolute horror as the voice of her loving husband echoed off the peeling wallpaper. Bradley did not just confess to major financial crimes, he viciously mocked her intelligence. He openly called her a stupid cash cow and bragged about manipulating her deep insecurities to secure his luxurious lifestyle. The sheer cruelty in his tone was unbearable. A blinding white-hot rage completely consumed her. With a guttural scream of pure agony, Monique hurled her expensive cell phone directly at the cracked plaster wall, shattering the screen into 100 jagged pieces. Just 2 hours later, the flimsy wooden door of the motel room creaked open. Bradley stumbled inside, looking like a completely beaten dog. He had managed to secure his temporary release by promising a highly dangerous, unlicensed bail bondsman the title to a non-existent luxury boat. He was covered in sweat dirt and dried blood from his violent arrest on the highway. He expected to find his wife frantically working the phones to hire a top-tier defense attorney. Instead, he found Monique standing in the center of the dark room, breathing heavily, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. Before Bradley could even open his mouth to complain about the terrifying county jail, Monique lunged at him. She did not yell or demand an explanation. She attacked him with the ferocity of a wild animal. Her manicured nails dug deeply into his cheeks as she violently slapped him across the face. Bradley stumbled backward, crashing into a cheap laminate dresser, shouting in confusion and pain. He aggressively pushed her away, demanding to know what had gotten into her. Monique screamed at the top of her lungs, throwing a heavy glass ashtray right at his head. It missed by inches, shattering against the doorframe. She shrieked that she had heard the entire recording. She told him that my father had sent her the exact audio file of his pathetic sniveling confession. Bradley froze instantly, the remaining color draining rapidly from his bruised face. The realization that his ultimate betrayal had been instantly weaponized against him hit him like a freight train. He tried to backtrack, stammering out pathetic excuses, claiming he only said those horrible things because he was terrified and desperate to get back to her. But Monique was not the gullible, desperate woman she was yesterday. She screamed that he was a parasitic leech, a worthless grifter who had completely ruined her life and destroyed her relationship with her only family. She violently grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, shaking him and demanding to know if he ever actually loved her at all. Bradley looked down at her, his fake charm completely evaporating. Cornered and stripped of all his lies, he finally showed her his true face. He aggressively shoved her backward onto the cheap mattress and laughed a cruel, hollow laugh. He told her she was completely delusional if she thought a guy like him would ever settle for a spoiled, high-maintenance brat like her without a massive trust fund attached to the deal. The brutal truth hit Monique harder than any physical blow. In a single devastating instant, the grand illusion of her perfect high society marriage shattered entirely. She thought back to their lavish destination wedding, the hundreds of expensive gifts, and the constant social media posts boasting about their perfect romance. It was all a meticulously crafted stage play. There was never any genuine love, mutual respect, or deep emotional connection. Their entire relationship was nothing more than a cold, calculated financial transaction completely underwritten by my heavy wallet. Bradley provided the charming, handsome aesthetic she needed to impress her snobby social circle, and in exchange she provided him with unlimited access to my hard-earned millions. She realized with sickening clarity that she was exactly like her mother, Valerie. She had foolishly tried to buy loyalty and affection with stolen money, and now the funds had completely dried up, leaving her utterly bankrupt in every conceivable way. Bradley did not waste another second pretending to care. He turned his back on his sobbing wife and forcefully yanked his leather duffel bag out of the small motel closet. He began aggressively tossing his remaining clothes and expensive watches into the bag, not bothering to fold a single item. He callously stepped over the shattered pieces of Monique's cell phone, completely indifferent to the massive emotional wreckage he was leaving behind. Monique sat on the edge of the bed, her chest heaving as she watched the only man she thought she could rely on actively abandon her. She weakly begged him to stay, terrified of facing this total financial ruin alone, but Bradley did not even look back. He zipped his heavy bag, threw it over his shoulder, and walked out the door into the dark night, leaving her completely alone with nothing but silence and the harsh glare of a flickering neon sign outside the window. Left with absolutely zero options, zero cash, and zero allies. Monique was forced to make the most humiliating journey of her entire life. She gathered her ruined designer clothes and caught a late-night public bus across the city to the seedy, run-down neighborhood where Valerie had been forced to rent a cheap furnished apartment. The bus ride was agonizingly long, forcing Monique to sit surrounded by the very working-class people she had spent her entire adult life openly mocking. When she finally arrived at the depressing brick apartment complex, she dragged herself up 3 flights of concrete stairs. She stood shivering outside the peeling wooden door, her heart pounding relentlessly in her chest. She raised a trembling fist and knocked loudly, desperately, hoping her mother would provide the safe sanctuary she so urgently needed. The heavy deadbolt clicked and the door swung open a few inches, held firmly by a tarnished security chain. Valerie stood in the narrow gap wearing a cheap, faded bathrobe. Her face was pale, drawn, and completely devoid of maternal warmth. Monique immediately burst into fresh tears, reaching out toward her mother, begging to come inside and sleep on the couch. Valerie did not move an inch. She looked at her daughter's ruined face, her eyes narrowing into cold, venomous slits. She spoke in a voice that was entirely dead and utterly merciless. She stated that the tabloid journalists had just called her for a comment on her federal tax fraud documents. She stared directly into Monique's desperate eyes and said, "You sold me out to the tabloids for pennies. You are completely dead to me." Valerie violently slammed the heavy wooden door directly in her crying daughter's face, throwing the deadbolt with a loud final click. Valerie slammed the door in Monique's face, but that small act of cruel dominance was nothing more than a fleeting illusion of control. The reality of her situation was rapidly closing in like a tightening noose. The next morning, her cheap, prepaid cell phone blew up with notifications. The sleazy tabloid journalist Monique had wasted absolutely no time. Headlines about her massive hidden tax fraud and the spectacular collapse of her stolen logistics empire were already plastered across gossip blogs and local news websites. Worse than the public humiliation was the aggressive legal onslaught. The primary banking institution had officially filed a massive civil lawsuit against her personally to recoup the $15 million deficit. Her offshore accounts were frozen, pending federal investigation, and her physical wallet was completely empty. She was backed entirely into a corner, stripped of her wealthy allies, and staring directly down the barrel of total financial and social annihilation. Desperation breeds highly dangerous decisions. Valerie knew she could not fight the bank or the federal government with an empty bank account and a ruined reputation. She needed leverage, and she needed it immediately. She firmly believed that my pristine, flawless legal maneuvering had to be a carefully constructed lie. She was entirely convinced that I had illegally hidden assets or forged corporate signatures to transfer the $15 million into Tariq's Community Health Foundation. If she could find hard physical proof of that alleged fraud, she could drag me down with her and potentially force a highly lucrative settlement to save herself from prison. She took the very last piece of genuine jewelry she possessed, a vintage diamond watch she had hidden in her coat pocket during her frantic escape from the estate, and brought it to a seedy downtown pawn shop. The pawnbroker gave her a fraction of its true value in crisp, unmarked $100 bills. Valerie took that dirty cash and drove to the darkest, most dangerous industrial sector of the city. She arranged a meeting in a dimly lit diner with a deeply corrupt private investigator. This man was a disgraced former police detective who specialized in corporate espionage, illegal wiretapping, and aggressive break-ins for desperate, wealthy clients. Valerie slid the thick envelope of cash across the sticky diner table. She looked him directly in the eyes and gave him a highly specific, highly illegal set of instructions. She ordered him to completely bypass the security systems at Tariq's newly opened medical foundation tonight. She wanted him to physically break into the main executive suite and tear the office apart until he found the primary financial ledgers linking my holding company to the nonprofit trust. Valerie leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She told the investigator that Cornell was a meticulous man, but every single man makes a mistake when moving millions of dollars in secret. She insisted that there had to be physical paper trails, hidden hard drives, or secret banking tokens locked away in Tariq's newly furnished office. She demanded that he completely gut the place if necessary. She did not care about the physical damage he caused to the medical facility. She only cared about securing the smoking gun that would prove the $15 million loan was a fraudulent scheme designed specifically to leave her with nothing. The investigator counted the money with a sickening grin, verifying the massive cash payment before casually slipping it into his worn leather jacket. He assured her that the medical clinic's security would be a complete joke to a professional of his caliber. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, entirely unfazed by the intense desperation rolling off her. He had dealt with hundreds of ruined wealthy spouses who suddenly found themselves at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. He laid out his strict terms of engagement. He stated that the cash she just handed him only covered the initial break-in and the extraction of the files. If the documents proved to be as valuable as she claimed, he would demand a massive percentage of any future financial settlement she squeezed out of me. Valerie did not have the luxury of negotiating. She firmly nodded her head, agreeing to the extortionate terms. She was entirely willing to make a deal with the devil if it meant she could drag me down into the blazing inferno with her. Watching the dirty investigator walk out of the diner, a sudden sickening wave of absolute nausea washed over Valerie. She stared down at her reflection in the cold black coffee sitting in front of her. She barely recognized the haggard, desperate woman staring back. Just a few short months ago, she used to command massive, opulent ballrooms with a simple snap of her manicured fingers. She was a woman who dictated the absolute highest standards of high society, a woman who fired loyal staff members for folding towels incorrectly and ruined local politicians over minor social slights. She possessed an untouchable aura of extreme wealth that made everyone around her bow in absolute submission. Now she was sitting in a filthy, cockroach-infested diner on the wrong side of the city, plotting a desperate midnight burglary with a common thug just to keep herself out of federal prison. She realized exactly how far she had fallen, completely stripped of her golden pedestal and forced to crawl through the dirt of her own making. But instead of feeling genuine remorse for the extreme greed that put her in this pathetic position, she only felt a burning, toxic hatred for me. She blamed me entirely for forcing her to stoop to this degrading level of criminality. She genuinely believed she was still the victim. At exactly 2 a.m, a heavy silence settled over the towering glass structure of Tariq's Community Health Foundation. The investigator picked the high-security electronic lock on the rear utility entrance with the practiced ease of a career criminal. He slipped quietly into the dark corridors, expertly avoiding the sweeping motion sensors and the rotating security cameras he had spent the afternoon studying. He crept silently up the concrete stairwell to the top floor, moving straight toward the primary executive office suite. He jimmied the heavy mahogany door open and stepped inside, clicking on a small, highly focused pen light. The office was immaculate and entirely organized. He began aggressively scanning the massive filing cabinets and the locked desk drawers, fully expecting to spend hours searching for the hidden safe Valerie had insisted must be there. But as he swept his narrow beam of light across the smooth surface of the heavy wooden desk, he stopped completely in his tracks. He did not have to drill a safe or violently tear the room apart. Sitting perfectly centered on the pristine leather desk pad, bathed in a sliver of moonlight bleeding through the large window, was a single thick manila file folder. The label on the front of the folder was clearly marked with Valerie's full legal name and the bold words denoting highly confidential financial ledgers. The investigator let out a low, greedy chuckle. He thought he had just hit the absolute jackpot. He assumed I had carelessly left the most incriminating evidence of my alleged fraud right out in the open, fully underestimating the lengths my ex-wife would go to secure her revenge. He eagerly snatched the heavy folder off the desk, practically tasting the massive cash bonus Valerie had promised him upon delivery. He turned around to make his swift exit, entirely confident that his mission was a complete success. The very second his dirty fingers grasped the thick edge of the manila folder and lifted it off the desk, the heavy silence of the office was completely shattered. The massive, bright overhead fluorescent lights snapped on instantly with a loud electrical hum, blinding him with their intense artificial glare. The investigator gasped loudly, dropping his pen light and spinning around in total, paralyzing panic. Sitting perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair in the far corner of the room was me. I was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, my hands resting calmly on the polished handle of my wooden cane. I stared directly at the terrified intruder with cold, unblinking eyes. I told him in a steady, lethal whisper that I had been waiting for him all night. In the exact same moment, the deafening wail of multiple police sirens erupted right outside the building, bathing the office windows in flashing red and blue lights. The blinding red and blue lights of the police cruisers flooded the executive office, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls. The dirty private investigator dropped the thick manila folder onto the leather desk pad as if it had suddenly caught fire. Heavy boots pounded down the corridor, and within seconds, uniformed officers burst through the heavy mahogany door with their weapons drawn and flashlights blinding him. The investigator did not put up a fight. He immediately dropped to his knees and laced his fingers securely behind his head. Less than an hour later, he was sitting in a cold, windowless steel interrogation room at the downtown police precinct. Facing the harsh glare of a seasoned detective, he did not hesitate for a single second. He completely flipped. He eagerly named Valerie as the sole mastermind behind the entire burglary operation, desperately trading her freedom for a highly reduced plea deal. The lead detective, sitting across the scratched metal table, grabbed the manila folder that the investigator had tried to steal. The investigator leaned back in his hard metal chair and smirked arrogantly, telling the police that they should be thanking him instead of locking him up. He claimed loudly that the folder contained hard, undeniable proof that I had committed massive corporate fraud and illegally funneled $15 million away from my poor, victimized ex-wife. The detective raised a skeptical eyebrow, opened the heavy cover, and began slowly flipping through the crisp pages. The arrogant smirk on the investigator's face completely vanished when he saw the look of utter confusion rapidly turning into sheer shock on the detective's face. There were no fake corporate invoices. There were no hidden logistics contracts pointing to me. The detective looked up, tossed the file back onto the table, and flatly stated that these documents had absolutely nothing to do with my company or Tariq's Medical Foundation. I had intentionally planted that specific folder right on the center of the desk, fully anticipating Valerie's desperate, highly predictable move. The documents inside were Valerie's old, highly secret financial ledgers. They contained a meticulous chronological record of every single dollar she had illegally siphoned hidden and completely failed to report to the federal government over the past decade. The pages detailed highly complex offshore shell companies, fake luxury purchases used strictly to wash dirty money, and massive capital gains that completely bypassed the federal tax system. She had hidden millions from the Internal Revenue Service to fund her lavish, secret lifestyle. By hiring a criminal to break into the clinic and steal those specific files, Valerie had legally established her desperate ownership of them. She had practically gift-wrapped her own massive financial crimes and handed them directly to the local authorities. The local detectives immediately realized the sheer magnitude of the evidence sitting on their table. This was no longer a simple local case of breaking and entering. This was a multi-million-dollar federal crime with massive prison implications. The precinct captain immediately picked up the phone and contacted the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Within minutes, federal agents were swarming the precinct, eagerly taking physical possession of the explosive ledgers that would completely end Valerie's life. The trap I set was flawless. I stood quietly in the shadows of the precinct lobby, watching the federal agents march out with the heavy evidence boxes. I had kept those exact ledgers locked securely in a hidden wall safe for nearly 10 years. When I first discovered her massive financial infidelity, finding out she was hoarding cash while I worked myself to the bone, my initial instinct was to burn the papers. I chose to protect her, not because I loved the cold woman she had become, but because I deeply wanted to shield our family name and protect Tariq from the devastating public fallout of a federal tax scandal. I silently carried the heavy burden of her hidden crimes, enduring her constant disrespect and toxic arrogance just to keep the family intact. But when she sat in that sleek mediation room and ruthlessly demanded everything I had ever built, the dynamic completely shifted. If she wanted absolute ownership of my legacy, she was going to take absolute ownership of her own deeply buried sins. I gave her exactly what she demanded. While the federal agents mobilized their heavily armed tactical units, Valerie was pacing frantically back and forth across the cheap-stained carpet of her rented apartment. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city, casting a weak gray light through the dirty plastic blinds. She kept checking her prepaid cell phone every 10 seconds, her heart pounding relentlessly against her ribs. She was entirely convinced that the investigator was currently on his way to deliver the golden ticket that would magically restore her stolen fortune and send me to a federal penitentiary. She fantasized about calling the tabloid journalists back, completely rewriting the narrative and watching me lose everything on the evening news. She walked into the tiny, outdated kitchen to pour herself a glass of tap water, trying desperately to calm her violently shaking hands and steady her breathing. She never even had the chance to take a single sip. The heavy wooden door of her apartment did not just rattle with a polite standard police knock. It exploded inward with a deafening, terrifying crash. Splinters of cheap wood and twisted metal flew across the living room as a highly coordinated team of federal agents in dark tactical gear swarmed into the tiny space. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision, shouting commanding orders that completely drowned out her high-pitched scream. Valerie dropped her glass, shattering it against the dirty linoleum floor, and backed away in sheer horror. She held up her trembling hands blindly, shouting that she was a wealthy socialite and demanding to know who was in charge of this massive outrage. The lead federal agent stepped through the ruined doorway, completely unimpressed by her frantic, entitled demands. He did not read her a standard police warning. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Valerie by her shoulders and forcefully spun her around, slamming her face first against the cheap drywall. They violently wrenched her arms behind her back and slapped heavy, freezing steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. Valerie sobbed uncontrollably, screaming that there was a massive mistake and demanding to call her expensive lawyer. The lead agent stepped directly into her line of sight, his expression cold and completely unforgiving. He loudly declared that there was no mistake at all. He read the official federal charges straight from his warrant. She was being formally arrested for felony tax evasion, massive financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit commercial burglary. As they dragged her toward the door, the agent delivered the final blow. No bail. 6 months later, Valerie found herself sitting at a heavy oak defense table in a federal courtroom. The staggering visual contrast from her previous court appearance was absolutely breathtaking. During our family court mediation, she had worn a custom-tailored silk suit adorned with sparkling diamonds, exuding the untouchable arrogance of a reigning queen. Today she was swallowed by a highly unflattering, brightly colored orange prison jumpsuit. The heavy steel shackles around her wrists and ankles clinked loudly against the wooden chair every single time she shifted her weight. Her perfectly dyed hair was now showing harsh gray roots, and her skin lacked the expensive glowing treatment she used to demand on a weekly basis. She looked incredibly small, deeply fragile, and utterly terrified. The federal prosecutors sitting across the aisle did not see a wealthy socialite. They saw a cornered criminal facing decades behind bars. The mighty had not just fallen, she had completely cratered into the earth. When Valerie was called to the witness stand in her own defense, she immediately launched into a highly theatrical, deeply rehearsed performance. She desperately attempted to play the ultimate victim for the 12 men and women sitting in the jury box. She forced large crocodile tears to stream down her pale cheeks, her voice trembling with manufactured trauma. She aggressively pointed a shackled finger across the courtroom directly at me, accusing her vindictive ex-husband of meticulously setting a massive financial trap. She wailed that she was nothing more than a simple, trusting wife who had been entirely manipulated by a ruthless corporate titan. She claimed she had absolutely no knowledge of the offshore tax havens, insisting I had forged her signatures on every single fraudulent ledger over the past decade. She painted a vivid, entirely fictional picture of severe emotional abuse, attempting to convince the jury that the $15 million corporate loan was a malicious scheme designed specifically to destroy her life. Her defense attorney gently guided her through the fabricated narrative, attempting to cast a dark shadow of reasonable doubt over the massive mountain of physical evidence stacked against her. But the jury did not look convinced. Her performance was entirely too polished, too desperate, and deeply contradicted by the hard paper trail. When the federal prosecutor finally called me to the witness stand as a hostile witness for the state, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted dramatically. I stood up from the gallery, buttoned my tailored charcoal suit, and walked calmly toward the front of the room. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the absolute truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I did not look at Valerie with anger, triumph, or malice. I looked at her with the exact same cold, dead indifference I would give a total stranger on the street. The defense attorney immediately tried to rattle me aggressively, pacing back and forth, questioning my motives and accusing me of planting the secret financial ledgers in Tariq's office just to frame my innocent ex-wife. He raised his voice, attempting to paint me as a bitter old man exacting illegal revenge. I did not raise my voice in return. I did not lean forward or display a single ounce of defensive body language. I answered every single aggressive question with a terrifying monotone precision. I completely stripped away the emotional drama and presented the court with pure, undeniable mathematics. I was the architect of my own business, and I knew every single number by heart. I explained to the jury that I had spent 40 years building a logistics empire through agonizing physical labor, sacrificing my youth and my health. While I was working 16-hour shifts, Valerie spent her days attending lavish parties and aggressively funneling my hard-earned cash into secret accounts. I testified that I had discovered her massive financial infidelity years ago. I detailed the exact dates, the specific shell companies, and the highly illegal tax shelters she had established completely behind my back. I told the jury that I had originally locked those highly incriminating ledgers away in a hidden wall safe to protect our family from public ruin. But during our divorce, Valerie aggressively demanded absolute ownership of every single asset I possessed. She signed a legally binding cross-liability waiver explicitly demanding total control of both the corporate assets and the historical corporate liabilities. I looked directly at the jury and stated clearly that I did not set a malicious trap. I simply gave the woman exactly what she legally asked for. She demanded everything, and she rightfully received her own hidden crimes in return. The defense attorney practically shouted, demanding to know how I could justify the cruel setup at the medical clinic, heavily implying that I had orchestrated the burglary myself. Before I could even formulate a response, the lead federal prosecutor stepped forward and completely derailed the defense's entire strategy. The prosecutor submitted a new piece of digital evidence into the official court record. It was a crystal-clear audio recording obtained directly from the corrupt private investigator's hidden body microphone, capturing the exact moment Valerie met him in that filthy downtown diner. The investigator had handed it over the moment he was arrested to secure his own plea deal. The prosecutor pressed a button on the media console, and Valerie's own venomous voice echoed loudly through the silent federal courtroom. The jury listened in absolute stunned horror as Valerie aggressively ordered the investigator to physically break into Tariq's foundation. They heard her explicitly demand the theft of confidential documents, completely disregarding the law and violating her own son's sanctuary just to save her own skin. They heard the cold, harsh clink of the $100 bills hitting the diner table as she paid for the felony burglary in cold, hard cash. The devastating audio recording completely vaporized her entire victim narrative. She was not a naive, manipulated wife cowering in fear. She was a highly calculating, ruthless criminal actively orchestrating a felony. Valerie sank incredibly low into her wooden chair, her face burning with profound humiliation as the undeniable truth echoed all around her. I glanced over at the defense table. Her highly paid attorney slowly removed his glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and dropped his face heavily into his hands. He knew instantly that the trial was completely over. There was absolutely no defense against her own recorded words. The jury did not even need a full hour to deliberate. They returned to the courtroom and delivered a swift, unanimous guilty verdict on every single federal charge. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the defense table. The judge ordered Valerie to stand for the official reading of her punishment. He looked down at her with absolute disgust, shuffling his thick stack of sentencing paperwork. The crushing reality of a lengthy federal prison term finally broke through Valerie's thick wall of denial. Her knees buckled, the heavy chains rattling loudly against the wooden floor. Completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity, she frantically scanned the crowded gallery. She locked eyes with Tariq, who was sitting quietly in the back row. She broke down into violent, hysterical sobs, screaming for the very son she had viciously disowned to stand up and save her character. Valerie's hysterical screams echoed desperately off the high ceilings of the federal courtroom, shattering the heavy silence that had followed the guilty verdict. She violently rattled her heavy steel shackles, thrashing against the solid oak table, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. She called out for Tariq over and over again, begging her only son to stand up and save her ruined character before the judge handed down her final punishment. From the very back row of the wooden gallery, Tariq slowly stood up. The entire courtroom immediately shifted its collective attention toward him. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and began walking down the center aisle. His footsteps were calm, steady, and highly deliberate, echoing loudly in the tense room. He approached the wooden podium designated for victim impact statements. Valerie looked up at him, her face completely covered in smeared tears and absolute terror. She aggressively clasped her shackled hands together, pleading silently with her wide eyes, putting on one last desperate performance of a loving mother begging her child for salvation. She truly believed her designated peacemaker would finally fold. Tariq stood behind the podium and calmly adjusted the microphone. He looked directly down at Valerie. He did not show a single ounce of pity, anger, or sadness. He spoke with a rich, resonant voice that carried absolute authority. He addressed the honorable judge, first formally identifying himself for the official court record. Then he slowly turned his focus back to the shivering woman in the orange prison jumpsuit. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to completely destroy her. He calmly reminded her of the night of my 70th birthday dinner. He painted a vivid picture for the court, recounting the exact moment she aggressively slid the divorce papers across the ruined birthday cake and ruthlessly demanded the massive estate, the luxury vehicles, and the entire logistics company. He looked directly into her eyes and repeated her exact venomous words out loud. He reminded the entire courtroom that she had demanded absolutely everything I possessed, except for him. He stated that she had openly viewed him as a miserable failure, a pathetic charity case, and a piece of useless trash to be casually discarded simply because his career in social work did not fit into her shallow, high society aesthetic. Valerie tried to interrupt him, sobbing violently and whispering his name through her tears, desperately trying to manipulate him one last time. Tariq simply raised his hand, a commanding gesture that instantly silenced her pathetic wailing. He told her clearly that her tears were entirely fake. He stated that she was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for her massive financial crimes or her horrific treatment of our family. She was only crying because she had finally been caught and was utterly terrified of living in a concrete cell. He reminded her of the morning she and Bradley had aggressively brought a locksmith to the guest house, violently kicking him out onto the street without a single dollar to his name. He pointed out the absolute irony of her current situation. She had ruthlessly built her entire identity on extreme greed, toxic manipulation, and stolen wealth. She had sold her own soul to acquire a magnificent castle, but because of her own blind arrogance, she was now left ruling over an empty kingdom of dust. He delivered his final crushing blow with terrifying calmness. He looked his mother dead in the eye and declared with absolute finality that he had no mother. As those incredibly heavy words left his mouth, a massive, invisible weight completely lifted off his shoulders. For his entire life, Tariq had carried the deep, agonizing trauma of being the unloved child. He had spent decades bending over backward, desperately trying to earn a single scrap of genuine validation from a woman who was fundamentally incapable of unconditional love. He had deeply internalized her vicious insults, constantly wondering if he was truly a burden, especially on the morning he was forcibly evicted from the estate. But standing right here in this federal courtroom, surrounded by the absolute, undeniable destruction of her shallow empire, he finally realized his own profound worth. He was a highly respected leader in his community, a man who dedicated his life to building up the broken instead of aggressively tearing them down. He was completely free from her toxic, suffocating shadow. He finally understood that her inability to love him was a reflection of her own broken soul, not a reflection of his value as a man. He no longer needed her approval to validate his existence, and that realization made him entirely bulletproof. Tariq finished his powerful statement politely, thanked the honorable judge for his time, and stepped away from the wooden podium. He did not give Valerie a second glance as he walked confidently back down the aisle to his seat in the gallery. Valerie collapsed forward onto the heavy defense table, burying her face in her shackled arms, letting out a guttural wail of pure agony. She finally realized that her absolute last lifeline had been completely and permanently severed. She was entirely alone. The judge leaned forward over his elevated bench, looking down at the defense table with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. He adjusted his microphone and stated for the official public record that he had presided over hundreds of complex federal fraud cases during his long career, but he had rarely seen a defendant display such a shocking level of calculated greed and total lack of human decency. He specifically noted her terrifying willingness to orchestrate a felony burglary against her own son's medical foundation just to cover up her massive history of tax evasion. He declared that her actions demonstrated a deeply ingrained criminal mindset that posed a significant ongoing threat to society. He firmly rejected any plea for leniency from the defense attorney, stating that her absolute lack of remorse warranted the maximum allowable penalty under federal sentencing guidelines. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, his face hardening with absolute judicial authority. The entire courtroom held its breath, the silence stretching out tightly as everyone waited for the final devastating numbers to drop. The judge's voice boomed across the silent room with absolute finality. He looked directly at the trembling woman in orange and stated his ruling. Valerie, for the severe crimes of felony tax evasion, massive financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit commercial burglary, I hereby sentence you to 5 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a deafening crack that sealed her fate forever. Valerie instantly erupted into violent, hysterical screams, thrashing wildly against the heavy wooden table as 2 large federal marshals aggressively grabbed her by the arms to drag her away to the holding cells. I did not stay to watch the pathetic, degrading spectacle. I calmly stood up from my seat, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, turned my back on the screaming woman, and walked through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the bright, warm sunlight. 6 months had passed since the heavy federal gavel sealed Valerie's fate and sent her to a concrete cell. While she was learning the brutal daily realities of federal prison, Bradley was desperately trying to claw his way back to the top of the social ladder. He had barely managed to avoid a lengthy jail sentence by turning state's evidence and aggressively throwing his wife and mother-in-law under the bus, but his reputation in the city's elite circles was completely destroyed. Stripped of his stolen wealth and his lavish, rent-free lifestyle, he was forced to buy a heavily discounted, poorly fitted suit from a clearance rack. He stood nervously in the grand marble lobby of the city's most prestigious investment firm. This was his absolute last chance to secure a high-paying executive position and rebuild his pathetic life as a wealthy grifter. He smoothed his cheap tie, pasted his signature charming smile across his face, and confidently strutted toward the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom. Bradley pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped confidently into the expansive sunlit boardroom. The room screamed of old money and ultimate corporate power. A massive mahogany table stretched across the center, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the bustling financial district below. At the far end of the long table, a high-backed leather executive chair was turned completely away from him, facing the impressive city skyline. Bradley cleared his throat loudly, puffing out his chest and projecting his voice with practiced, entirely fake enthusiasm. He introduced himself as the new senior portfolio management candidate, aggressively listing the completely fabricated achievements on his heavily padded resume. He spoke at length about his alleged experience in high-level asset management, intentionally omitting the fact that his only real financial strategy had ever been marrying my daughter and systematically draining my personal bank accounts. He laid his cheap leather portfolio on the table, expecting the unseen executive to immediately applaud his aggressive pitch. The leather executive chair slowly swiveled around. Bradley's confident, rehearsed smile instantly vanished. The expensive facade he was trying to project completely crumbled in a fraction of a second. Sitting directly across from him, resting my hands comfortably on the polished mahogany table, was me. I was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking entirely at home in the center of the massive corporate fortress. Bradley physically stumbled backward, his cheap shoes squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. His eyes grew wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He stammered frantically, looking around the empty boardroom, desperately trying to comprehend what was happening. He weakly asked me what I was doing sitting in the chairman's seat. I did not smile. I did not stand up to greet him. I leaned forward slightly and folded my hands together. I calmly informed him that I had finalized the aggressive, hostile takeover of this specific investment firm exactly 1 month ago. I told him that I was now the majority shareholder and the acting chairman of the board. The color violently drained from his bruised face as the crushing reality of his situation fully set in. He had walked right into the lion's den. He tried to quickly recover his composure, forcing a weak, trembling smile. He nervously suggested that perhaps we could put the past behind us and work together as professionals. He actually had the sheer audacity to ask if I would personally endorse his candidacy for the senior management position. I simply stared at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence completely crush his pathetic attempt at corporate diplomacy. Standing frozen in the center of my new boardroom, Bradley finally realized the absolute magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. His mind violently flashed back to that chilly afternoon on my estate driveway. He remembered the exact moment he arrogantly blocked my path, openly mocked my age, and aggressively demanded the keys to my vintage silver Porsche. He had genuinely believed I was nothing more than a weak, washed-up old man who lacked the intelligence and the sheer willpower to fight back against his toxic youth and his inherent white privilege. He had spent years treating me like a convenient stepping stone, a silent bank teller whose only purpose was to fund his unearned lifestyle. Looking at me now, commanding a multi-billion-dollar investment firm with absolute effortless authority, he finally understood the terrifying depth of my power. He realized that I had built a massive empire in the 1980s by aggressively destroying corporate bankers who were 10 times smarter and 100 times more ruthless than him. He had brought a plastic knife to a nuclear war, completely underestimating the brilliant, calculating black man sitting before him. Bradley began to visibly sweat, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. The cheap fabric of his suit clung uncomfortably to his shaking frame. He opened his mouth to offer another pathetic, sniveling apology, but I completely cut him off. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I reached into my leather desk folio and slowly pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy cardstock. I slid it deliberately across the long mahogany table until it stopped right at the edge, directly in front of him. Bradley slowly approached the table with trembling hands and picked up the paper. It was not a job offer. It was a formal, legally binding blacklisting order. It detailed his history of severe financial mismanagement, his recent felony arrest on the highway, and his documented willingness to commit corporate fraud. The document was officially signed by me and deeply endorsed by the primary regulatory board of the state's financial sector. I looked at him with icy indifference and informed him that this exact document had already been digitally distributed to every single reputable bank, investment firm, and wealth management agency within a 500-mile radius. I told him that he was permanently banned from the financial industry. He would never manage another portfolio, he would never secure another corporate loan, and he would absolutely never step foot inside an executive boardroom ever again. The grifter's entire livelihood was instantly and permanently eradicated with a single stroke of my pen. Bradley stared at this blacklisting order in his shaking hands, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The complete realization that he would never work in luxury again completely broke him. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with absolute despair, and opened his mouth to beg for mercy. I did not give him the chance to speak a single word. I casually reached over to the sleek intercom console on my desk and pressed the silver button. "Security," I whispered calmly into the microphone. "Please come up to the boardroom and throw this trash out." Less than 2 minutes later, 2 massive security guards physically dragged a kicking and screaming Bradley through the pristine marble lobby. They threw him violently out the heavy glass doors, sending him crashing face first onto the cold, wet sidewalk just as the freezing rain began to fall. Exactly 1 full year had passed since the brutal financial reckoning that completely purged the toxic elements from my life. The relentless freezing rain that had washed Bradley out of my corporate lobby was now just a distant memory. I sat comfortably in the deep leather armchair of my new luxurious estate study. A massive stone fireplace crackled warmly in the corner, casting a rich golden light across the ceiling high bookshelves. The heavy oak doors opened quietly, and my newly hired estate manager walked in carrying a silver tray stacked with the morning mail. Most of the envelopes were thick, expensive cardstock containing invitations to exclusive charity galas and high society dinners. But resting right at the very top of the pile was a thin, cheap paper envelope. It bore the stark, unmistakable ink stamp of a high-security federal penitentiary. The estate manager bowed his head respectfully and quietly backed out of the room, leaving me entirely alone with the letter. I reached out and picked up the flimsy envelope, feeling the cheap, rough texture of the state-issued paper between my fingers. I stared down at the return address block. It was written in a frantic, shaky cursive script that I immediately recognized. It was Valerie. Even after 12 grueling months locked inside a concrete cell, she was still desperately trying to reach me. This was not the first time she had tried to re-establish contact. Over the past year, my legal team had intercepted dozens of similar letters and frantic phone calls directed to my corporate offices. Jonathan, my attorney, had briefed me on the contents of her previous attempts. She was constantly begging for cash deposits to her prison commissary account so she could afford basic toiletries, decent food, and phone cards. She wrote endless, pathetic pages begging for my forgiveness, desperately trying to manipulate our 40 years of marriage to extract a single ounce of sympathy. She claimed she had found religion, that she was a completely changed woman, and that she finally understood the massive pain she had caused me. But I knew the absolute truth. Valerie was not sorry for her massive financial crimes, her chronic infidelity, or the horrific way she treated our son. She was only sorry that her extravagant stolen lifestyle had been violently ripped away. She was not seeking genuine redemption. She was simply looking for a new automated teller machine to make her miserable incarceration slightly more comfortable and perhaps fund a desperate legal appeal. I held the sealed envelope up to the flickering light of the fire. A younger, weaker version of myself might have torn it open out of morbid curiosity. A part of me might have wanted to read the desperate, groveling words of the woman who used to command the city's elite, but I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual anger, no burning desire for further revenge, and certainly no lingering affection. I slowly stood up from my leather chair and walked deliberately toward the massive stone fireplace. I extended my arm and simply let go. The cheap paper drifted downward, landing directly in the center of the blazing logs. The dry envelope instantly curled and blackened, bursting into bright orange flames. I stood there in total silence, watching the very last physical connection to my toxic past completely turn to white ash and float up the dark chimney. Watching the flames consume her desperate lies, a profound, undeniable sense of absolute peace washed over my entire soul. For decades, I had been carrying the massive, suffocating weight of her toxic arrogance and endless greed. I had foolishly believed that keeping the family together was my ultimate duty as a man, even as they systematically drained my spirit and openly mocked my working-class roots. I realized right then that my greatest victory was not legally destroying her stolen logistics empire or bankrupting her arrogant son-in-law. The true victory was finally purging my own heart of their insidious poison. I had successfully excised the malignant tumor that was slowly killing me from the inside out. Now at 71 years old, my life was completely my own. My mornings were no longer filled with screaming matches over credit card bills. I spent my days advising Tariq on his rapidly expanding medical foundation, playing chess in the quiet park, and actually enjoying the vast wealth I had spent a lifetime building. The quiet tranquility of my warm study was abruptly shattered by the sharp melodic chime of the main estate doorbell. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The weather outside had taken a violent turn over the last hour, developing into a freezing torrential downpour that violently lashed against the thick glass of my tall windows. Unscheduled visitors were strictly prohibited at my new residence, and the heavy iron gates at the bottom of the long driveway were supposed to be securely locked at all times. I walked over to my heavy mahogany desk and tapped the sleek touchscreen of the integrated security console. The high-definition camera feed from the front porch flickered onto the screen, illuminated by the harsh glare of the motion-activated floodlights. My heart skipped a sudden, unexpected beat. Standing right in the middle of the pouring rain, completely soaked to the bone, was Monique. The luxurious, designer lifestyle she had so violently fought to maintain was entirely gone. She was wearing a cheap, oversized raincoat that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing wind. Her face was pale, gaunt, and completely stripped of the arrogant makeup she used to wear like a weapon. But it was what she was holding tightly against her chest that caused the breath to catch in my throat. Wrapped tightly in a thick, faded woolen blanket was a newborn baby. Monique was violently shivering, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably as she desperately pressed the intercom button over and over again. She was looking directly up into the security camera lens, her eyes wide with absolute primal terror, silently begging her father to grant her shelter from the storm. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden desk, the glowing security screen casting a pale blue light across my face. The relentless rain pounded against the camera lens, distorting the image of the desperate woman standing on my porch. My right hand slowly hovered directly over the glowing green button that would instantly release the electronic deadbolts on the front doors. I looked at the ruined face of the daughter who had gleefully watched me lose everything. Then I shifted my gaze to the tiny, innocent bundle she was desperately trying to shield from the freezing elements. The child had absolutely no part in the massive web of betrayal, greed, and destruction her parents had so eagerly woven. The absolute master of ruthless consequences was suddenly faced with the ultimate agonizing test. Would I maintain my impenetrable fortress, or would I finally show mercy? I stared at the glowing green button that would open the massive iron gates and allow my shivering daughter into the warmth of my secure estate. My hand hovered over the console for a long, heavy moment. I looked at the newborn child on the security feed, an innocent life completely unaware of the massive storm of betrayal, greed, and toxic manipulation swirling around her. But then I looked deeply at Monique's face. If I opened those heavy doors and let her walk into my home, I would be actively inviting the exact same toxic entitlement back into my sacred sanctuary. I slowly pulled my hand away from the gate release button and reached for the silver intercom microphone instead. I pressed the transmission key, my voice cutting sharply through the howling wind and pounding rain. I did not sound angry, and I did not sound cruel. I sounded completely resolute and entirely unmovable. I told Monique that she was not coming inside my house tonight, tomorrow, or any day after that. I refused to let her bring her manufactured chaos across my threshold ever again. Monique let out a devastated, high-pitched wail that echoed through the intercom speaker, burying her face into the wet blanket shielding her baby. She desperately begged me to reconsider, screaming that she had absolutely nothing left, no money, no husband, and nowhere else to turn. I calmly informed her that I had already anticipated this exact scenario and made the necessary arrangements for her basic survival. But those arrangements would be strictly on my terms, not hers. I released the microphone button and picked up my cell phone, dialing my attorney Jonathan, who was currently working late reviewing contracts in the guest wing of the estate. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion opened. Jonathan walked out into the freezing downpour, holding a large black umbrella over his head and carrying a thick, waterproof leather folder. He walked briskly down the long gravel driveway to the iron gates, standing on the opposite side of the cold metal bars from my weeping daughter. He did not unlock the gate. He did not invite her onto the property to dry off. He simply held the large umbrella forward through the bars to shield the innocent baby from the freezing rain and unzipped the leather folder. He pulled out a single legal contract and a heavy steel pen. Jonathan spoke with the exact same cold, calculated corporate professionalism he had used against Valerie's lawyers in the mediation room a year ago. He told Monique that I had officially established an ironclad financial trust fund for my new granddaughter. However, he made it explicitly legally clear that Monique would never have access to a single dime of that money. The trust was meticulously designed to pay strictly for the child's healthcare, basic clothing allowance, and future educational tuition, with all financial payments going directly to the medical vendors and educational institutions. Monique could not touch it to fund her lifestyle. As for Monique herself, Jonathan outlined her harsh new reality. I was offering her a legally binding employment contract. She would be officially hired as a full-time janitorial worker at Tariq's Community Health Foundation. She would be responsible for scrubbing public toilets, mopping the emergency room floors, and taking out the hazardous medical waste every single night. She would be paid exactly the state minimum wage, not a single penny more, and her employment was strictly at will. If she complained about the work, arrived late for her shift, or caused any type of dramatic scene, she would be fired immediately, and the meager housing stipend attached to the janitorial job would be permanently revoked. Jonathan held the pen out through the wet iron bars and flatly told her that this contract was her one and absolute only lifeline. Monique stared at the damp legal document through the rain-soaked bars, her eyes burning with a sudden violent flare of her old toxic pride. Just a year ago, she would have spat directly in Jonathan's face for daring to offer her a minimum wage janitorial position. She was a woman who used to fly to Paris on a whim and spend thousands of dollars on a single pair of designer shoes without even glancing at the price tag. She considered manual labor to be entirely beneath her social class. The very idea of wearing a uniform and scrubbing public toilets made her physically nauseous. But as she opened her mouth to angrily reject the highly insulting offer, a loud, undeniable growl echoed from her empty stomach. The freezing rain soaked deeper into her tired bones, and the newborn baby in her arms gave a weak, hungry cry that pierced right through her massive ego. The harsh, undeniable reality of her desperate situation finally shattered the very last remaining pieces of her arrogance. The glorious era of endless free money, stolen luxury, and consequence-free living was completely dead and buried. With her hands shaking violently from the freezing cold and the sheer magnitude of her total defeat, she reached through the iron bars and took the pen. She signed her signature on the dotted line, weeping bitterly as she officially traded her stolen golden crown for a mop and a plastic bucket. Time moved steadily forward, completely washing away the toxic wreckage of the past and allowing solid new foundations to settle. Fast forward another full year. Tariq's Community Health Foundation had successfully become the absolute crown jewel of the city's medical network. He was leading massive expansion projects, saving lives on a daily basis, and completely fulfilling the righteous legacy I had always envisioned for our family name. Every single morning before the clinic officially opened its doors to the public, Monique could be seen pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down the sterile white hallways. She wore a standard, unflattering gray uniform, keeping her head down and scrubbing the floors in absolute silence, completely invisible to the wealthy donors and respected doctors who frequently walked through the building. She was earning her daily survival, one painful, deeply humiliating hour at a time, completely stripped of her former entitlement. Bradley was entirely erased from the corporate world, his permanent blacklisting keeping him out of any respectable office. He was last seen drifting aimlessly between temporary homeless shelters on the edge of town, taking grueling under-the-table day labor jobs just to afford cheap meals and cheap liquor. Valerie remained firmly locked inside her concrete federal cell, her frantic, desperate letters to the outside world completely ignored by everyone she used to ruthlessly command. Her high society friends had entirely forgotten her name. The villains of my story were all exactly where they rightfully belonged, facing the brutal consequences of their own actions. As for me, I spent my quiet, sunny afternoons sitting at a stone table in the center of the beautiful city park. The bright autumn sun warmed my back as I studied the carved wooden pieces on the checkered board sitting in front of me. I was completely unbothered, entirely at peace, and deeply enjoying the magnificent retirement I had rightfully earned through decades of hard work. I looked calmly across the chessboard at my opponent, an old neighborhood friend who had just made a highly aggressive, poorly calculated move in a desperate attempt to capture my knight. I smiled warmly, picking up my black rook and sliding it smoothly across the polished board to trap his king. They thought I was incredibly weak because I actively chose absolute peace over senseless shouting. They thought my complete silence during the divorce was a pathetic surrender. They completely forgot that the quietest, most patient storms always do the absolute most damage in the end. I did not fight my greedy family with blinding rage or loud public violence. I simply gave them every single thing they ruthlessly asked for, and I stepped aside to let their own blinding greed dig their massive, inescapable graves. I set my wooden piece down onto the final square with a sharp, highly satisfying click, looking directly into my opponent's surprised eyes. "Checkmate," I said softly, claiming my ultimate victory as the golden sun set perfectly over my new, beautifully quiet life. As I sit here in the quiet comfort of my sunlit park, moving my wooden chess pieces across the polished board, another profound realization settles deeply into my spirit. We are often taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water and that family must be protected at all costs. Society constantly demands that we endure endless disrespect, financial drain, and emotional abuse simply because the perpetrators share our last name. But the most vital lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood absolutely never gives anyone the right to completely destroy your inner peace. For decades, I mistakenly believed that providing limitless financial support was the ultimate expression of a fatherly love. I worked myself to the point of absolute physical exhaustion, thinking that if I could just buy them enough expensive things, they would eventually learn to respect me. I bought the sprawling estates, the imported cars, and the sparkling diamonds, genuinely hoping those heavy luxury items would somehow anchor their floating morality. Instead, I only succeeded in funding their extreme entitlement. I realized too late that giving endless resources to deeply ungrateful people is like pouring fresh water directly into toxic sand. They drank the water greedily but remained entirely barren and empty inside. True wealth is not measured by the square footage of your massive home or the shiny metallic emblem proudly stamped onto the front of your luxury vehicle. True wealth is possessing a quiet mind when you lay your head on the pillow at night. It is waking up in the morning without the sickening dread of impending manufactured drama. When I finally surrendered the heavy financial empire to Valerie, she thought I was losing my entire identity. But in surrendering the money, I finally purchased my absolute freedom. You must fiercely protect your energy from those who view your kindness as a glaring weakness. When people repeatedly show you their true colors, you must believe them the very first time. I spent decades ignoring the ugly red flags because it was easier to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy family than to face the terrifying reality of their inherent selfishness. I tolerated the subtle insults, the blatant financial manipulation, and the cruel dismissal of my dedicated son. I enabled their atrocious behavior by continuously shielding them from the harsh natural consequences of their own terrible destructive choices. That was my biggest mistake. By saving them from the fire, I allowed them to keep playing with matches inside my own house. Never again. We often fear that setting strict boundaries will make us the villain in a totally different story. But you have to be entirely willing to be the bad guy in the narrative of a toxic person if it means protecting your own sanity. Valerie and Monique painted me as a cruel monster to anyone who would listen. I let them complain. A lion does not lose sleep over the opinions of deeply confused, greedy sheep. Another crucial aspect of this journey is understanding clearly that walking away does not mean you are giving up on love. It means you are finally choosing to love yourself enough to step out of the endless cycle of abuse. When I sat in that sleek mediation room and signed away the logistics company, I was not admitting defeat. I was actively signing a permission slip to begin living the rest of my life surrounded only by authentic respect. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that repeatedly made you feel violently ill in the very first place. Sometimes the most loving thing you can possibly do for a highly entitled person is to let them crash completely into the hard concrete of reality. If I had continued to pay Bradley his bail, or if I had opened my heavy iron gates to let Monique inside during the freezing storm, I would have only delayed their inevitable destruction. I would have robbed them of the harsh, necessary lessons they desperately needed to learn. True growth only happens when the comfortable safety net is permanently removed. My tough love forced them to finally face their massive, glaring personal flaws. Furthermore, I learned that vindication does not require a loud, screaming audience. You do not need to publicly embarrass your abusers to win the war. The greatest revenge you can ever achieve is simply living an incredibly joyful, unbothered life, completely outside of their dark, toxic reach. When I dropped that desperate prison letter directly into the blazing fireplace without opening it, I did not feel a rush of angry triumph. I just felt a profound, overwhelming lightness in my chest. I had successfully reclaimed the steering wheel of my own destiny, leaving the heavy baggage far behind me forever. My relationship with Tariq has blossomed into the greatest joy of my twilight years. Watching him lead his foundation, treating every single patient with the genuine dignity his mother refused to show him, proves that true legacy is built on compassion, not currency. He broke the generational curse of our family by refusing to let his heart turn cold. He chose the difficult path of service over the incredibly easy road of stolen luxury. I am so intensely proud to call him my son, and I am highly honored to stand beside him as he heals our deeply broken community. If my intense journey has resonated with your own personal struggles, please know that you are never entirely alone. You possess the absolute power to rewrite the rules of your own life and firmly reject anyone who routinely disrespects your boundaries. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you found value in these hard lessons, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Drop a comment below telling me exactly how you protect your own inner peace from toxic people. Until next time, always remember your profound, undeniable true worth.